get to the first topic.
Mr. Chairman, just housekeeping. You do have a packet in front of you with an updated agenda. The only item on the agenda that's updated is in the K-3 reading area to include a section for the members to report back to the committee on any discussions they've had with school districts on their K-3 reading assessment. In addition to the updated agenda, there's hard copies of additional materials that were provided after your packets were mailed. So those are included in that. The one item you will not have in hard copy this morning will be the university's presentation. It'll be shown on the screen. It's also on the website for those members that are going to utilize their computers. So that's the only housekeeping items we have, Mr. Chairman. Oh, and yeah, and Mr. Chairman, we have an updated bill draft for the K-3 reading assessment bill, and we'll get to that when the item's on the agenda.
I want to just start out with a few remarks, and then I'm going to invite Co-Chairman Paxton to do the same. And what I want to do is put in perspective the discussions we're going to have on the K-3 reading assessment intervention program. You know, this is probably the most important thing we do as a state government, because it's just key to our education system going forward. You've got to learn how to read in the first 3 grades, or you're really behind the 8 ball the rest of your academic career and probably the rest of your life, because it is so central to everything else we do. And what we do in the first 3 grades primarily is teach reading. And then after that, we assume the kid knows how to read. And it looks like we're getting a significant number of kids that are not learning how to read. And that looks like a problem. We'll probably discuss it as a problem, say, what can we do to solve the problem? But the perspective I want to put on it is Wyoming really has one of the best education systems in these United States. And it's a human system, and I never yet saw a human system that couldn't be improved. And that's what we're out to try to do. And it is really, our education system is the most important thing the state government does. That's what our founders said in 1890 when they wrote our Constitution. And that's doubly true today with the high-tech world we live in. So improving it is probably the most important thing the legislature can do. And our role really is setting the system by passing laws. And so we need to understand how it's working and where it can be improved. And I think it may sound negative on occasion today, but keep in mind that what we're trying to do is improve one of the better systems in the country. And I don't want to get into the business of finding fault with any particular individual for not having a perfect system. But I think the committee is unified in wanting to make the system better so that we can reach everybody. And I think it's important to keep that perspective. Chairman Paxton, do you want to say a few words?
Well, just looking at our agenda, we have a really robust agenda ahead of us, and judging from our last meeting in Saratoga, we have people that maybe stretch out the conversation a little longer than necessary, and we would really appreciate brevity. We have a long agenda, and we want to give every item on there equal consideration, and if we let it get out of hand at the beginning, then the final items kind of get pushed aside. So we would appreciate that, and welcome. We're looking forward to a great meeting.
suggestions and whatnot, be blunt about what you mean. That avoids a lot of trouble. With that, first up is State Department of Education, Shelley Hamill. How do you pronounce your last name? Okay. Chief Academic Officer, State Department of Education, welcome. Proceed.
Good morning. Mr. Chairman and committee members, as Senator Scott said, I am Shelley Hamill, who I'm in Department of Education. And I appreciate the opportunity to be back and to follow up with some of the questions that we left unresolved at the Saratoga meeting earlier this summer. So one of the questions that was posed was, what are the actual class size averages for K-3 of our classrooms across the state of Wyoming? And as a little bit of background, in 2011, House Enrolled Act 98 implemented class requirements that districts maintain an average student-teacher ratio of 16:1. That was repealed in 2017. So from that time, 2011 through the 2017 school year, the crew report reflected those K-3 average class sizes for across the state. With that change in 2017, we no longer see the crew report those types of details. So instead, what we find is that there are some appendices that provide some information, but they don't drill down to the K-3 class size average. So Appendix F shows the elementary class size, keeping in mind that that would include all elementary grades. So kindergarten through 6 or kindergarten through 5, depending on the school's configuration. Appendix J shows class sizes for K-12 configurations, so our very smallest school districts. And then Appendix L shows class size averages and class sizes specific for K-8 configurations.
Those appendixes, are they available? Where are they?
They're available on the WDE website through that link. They're pretty lengthy to have printed all of them out, so.
Okay, what do they show? What, can you tell us what the class size averages are?
What I can tell you is that there's quite a range. When in looking at Appendix F, a low end average elementary class size of 1 student is noted for at least 1 district. But then on the high end, we saw an average elementary class size of 34.8. So, and keeping in mind that would be K through 5 or K through 6, depending on how the district is configured.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just a quick question. Do you have the ability to request, do we have to statutorily request districts to provide the classroom size for K through 3, or can the department ask for that through rule and regulation?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, at this point, we don't have the statutory, there's not statutory language to require that school districts or that it be calculated that way as it was previous to 2017.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, just to follow up, and I'll ask staff, and maybe they can look into it. Do they have authority to request that information of districts, or do we have to provide that authority if we want it?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, Tanya Heitrick, Legislative Service Office. I think there's probably broad statutory authority for the department to promulgate rules and regulations to administer the entire Education Act. There's a specific data set that you're after. Of course, we could prepare a bill to request that specifically.
And maybe I'm just being slow here, but this is one of the fundamentals. I'm still unclear as to, it sounds to me like we're not achieving the lower class size that we've been funding. And we're still funding based on that, are we not? What kind of variation are we seeing?
Mr. Chairman, as I stated, we were seeing all the way from, a very small school having one student, so that would be their average, all the way to maybe a larger school district having 34.8 students as an average. And again, that would be K through 5 or K through 6. It wouldn't just be the kindergarten through 3rd grade. I don't have the ability to extract that information by grade level.
Committee looked at the question as we go.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next question was, is there a correlation between Title I funding and reading assessment proficiency? So in working with one of our statisticians at the WDE, I asked this question, and he explicitly said there are far too many confounding variables to be able to answer this question accurately. And in my simplistic mindset, I said, certainly we must be able to draw some kind of a comparison. And he said, really, we're not able to, that there are the confounding variables or other elements that might be bearing on the situation can't really be addressed in a simple comparison. So he said that the only way to really know is to have, a group of students that qualify for Title I funding, to divide those students in half, provide the interventions to one and not to the other, and see what happens, which is completely unethical. So short of, I think, some, I guess I should say, he didn't feel as though there was a way to really extrapolate that.
Mr. Chairman? Thank you. Is it Ms. Hamel or Dr. Hamel?
It's, Mr. Chairman and Representative Connolly, it's just Ms. Hamel or Shelley is fine. Thank you.
Ms. Hamel, I'm curious, in other places, there's language of a Title I school, not just schools that receive Title I funding. Do we use that designation at all? And would that be one way to be able to get at the information that was asked?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Connolly. So we do have some schools in our state that are identified as school-wide Title I programs, which means that their poverty levels are higher, and they're able to qualify that way, meaning that they can use their Title I funds with all students in their building. They can braid those funds into their other funding mechanisms. And so again, I think that there would be some caution in drawing too many comparisons or correlations between those, the fact that that funding is there and their reading results. I think that's what I took away from my time spent with our statistician, that we should be cautious about drawing those kinds of correlations.
Mr. Chairman, follow? So Ms. Hamel, I think, why don't we get that information and then we can judge for ourselves whether or not it has too many confounding variables. But because we do have Title I designated schools, I think we could get some information that might be valuable to understand the difference perhaps with the outcomes in those schools that have that kind of additional resource than those that don't.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Connolly, we can certainly pull that together.
Let me ask the question a little differently. It strikes me that Title I is a major factor here. How much federal money we're spending a year, Title I?
40 million, I think, around 40 million, 42 million.
40 million?
I think so.
Alice, do we have a more precise number?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, we were discussing the statutory reference for class sizes. I missed the question.
Okay, the question was how much Title I money was spent.
Mr. Chairman, the Department of Education administers that grant to the districts. I would have to defer to the Department of Education.
Mr. Chairman, I think so. I can pull that up.
So since we didn't come with a correlation, let me ask the question a little differently. Would we be better off? Would we be teaching better to refuse the money? The federal government sometimes they provide money and then provide strings that defeat the purpose, and they're not effective. And so I think that with any federal money, you've got to ask that question. Are we better off without it? What's your sense? Is spending that money actually improving our results in the reading area or not?
Mr. Chairman, I guess I would say that I believe that school districts are probably best situated to answer that question since they have to respond to the strings attached. To some degree, we do as well. But I think that we see a lot of positive work being funded with that money.
Committee, anything else on this? Seeing none, go ahead, proceed.
Thank you. The next question is how many students are identified for a reading intervention program, either through an individualized education program or individual reading plan? So as most of you likely know, Wyoming Statute 213401 Section B does require that any student not showing appropriate progress towards development of the literacy, and it says not showing appropriate reading competence, be placed on an individual reading plan or an IRP. But the statute does not require that a school district report to the WDE how many students have been identified to receive that level of service and have an IRP developed. The statute also goes on to say that any student that is receiving services through an IEP, they qualify for special education and they receive services that address any type of learning challenges on that IEP, that they meet that requirement through the IEP. They don't have to have an additional IRP developed. And again, districts are not required to report to us at the WDE the number of students that are receiving reading services on their IEP. What I can tell you is that, as I noted in the memo, that state level special education data identifies students by disability categories rather than by services provided. And I think this is important to mention because of the 13 different federally identified special education categories, a student could be receiving reading services in any of those 13. So it would be difficult to say just students with this or that specific category.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So I have a couple of questions here. One is similar to my last question. Do we have to provide you statutory authority, or can you in fact, on your own through rulemaking, find out how many kids are on IEPs for reading? In other words, can you do this on your own, or do we have to provide you authority? So I guess that's back to staff as well.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, I would direct you to 213401 subsection C. It requires that the department annually report a variety of information on these students, including the percentage meeting and exceeding proficiency levels and the aggregate number of students identified by the screening instruments.
So Mr. Chairman, it appears that you're required to do that and you're not. So that would be one question. And then the other question is, as we look at these IEPs and districts, you know, it seems like from what we were told last time, and consequently we drafted a bill, but do we know, is there any consistency between how a student is placed into an IEP across the state? In other words, if you have a child in one district that is under an IEP for reading, and you have another one in another district, is there any correlation? In other words, is there any kind of standard common to that would put them in an IEP across the whole state? Or is it just whatever assessment that district uses that places?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, thank you for those questions. I'm going to try to address each one. So while the statute says that districts are required to report the aggregate number of students that have demonstrated signs or difficulty, it doesn't necessarily identify that those students all went on to need an individualized reading plan. So there's a disconnect between that data and how many students may or may not be on an IRP or an IEP. And then the question about special education, the consistency. So there are, across our state, for the most part, districts use a testing methodology that would identify students in a fairly consistent manner for qualifying for special education. So a student needs to first be identified as a child with a disability, one of the 13 categories. And then second, there has to be a need for specially designed instruction to qualify for special education. Those two components have to be met. I think that I would like to believe that there's a lot of consistency across our state in identifying students with disabilities.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to follow up here because some of the language I think gets confusing between an IEP and an IRP. My understanding is IEPs are standardized across not only the state, but the nation, and that students need to be identified. They go through triennials in order to be assessed and with the outcome of different kinds of interventions. An IRP, though, is very, very different. And could you talk a little bit about the distinction between them? Because in all honesty, our interest with this is not just IEPs, right? It's not just getting kids that have learning disabilities or whatever of any of those categories. It is catching kids early who are having trouble reading so that they don't end up on IEPs. So an IRP is designed to, in some ways, prevent an IEP. And so can you talk more specifically about how IRPs are being assessed between and among districts and the interventions that are going on specifically with IRPs and any kind of reporting that we know about these IRPs, interventions, and then their outcomes?
Yes, Mr. Chairman and Representatives. So again, lots of pieces to that question. So as you stated, an IEP, or an individualized education program, is a federally required component for a child that qualifies for special education. It's very regulated through statute, through federal statute and through state statute. So again, a lot of consistency. As you stated, the IRP is something that is built into our state statute, requiring school districts that when they identify that a child is struggling, hopefully early in their MTSS system, that they would step in, create that IRP, address and track the child's difficulties. And of course, they're assessing their constantly, and then they're going to be adjusting that IRP as necessary to help that student overcome the obstacles. That's the intent. A student may have an IRP at some point who goes on to be recommended to the school BIT team or the building intervention team that is then forwarded for special education assessment. So more diagnostic assessment.
Mr. Chairman, exactly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But Ms. Hamill, what do we know about IRPs in the state? How many of them? How many get honestly transferred to IEPs? What kind of interventions are being used in their success rate? What do we know about IRPs, which again, we put into statute in order to help kids not needing IEPs?
Mr. Chairman and Representative, I don't think we have a lot of information about IRPs. There,
And Mr. Chairman, I want to go back to Representative Summers' question. Why not? Because it seems to me, when I look at subsection C, we should know that subsection C is requiring you to collect that data. So we can understand whether or not what we put into statute is working, making sense, and actually doing what we wanted to. So what is it in subsection C that is allowing you to not collect that data and let us know? What do we need to do differently, perhaps, is another question.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, it sounds like that we need to add some collection, some data elements to the district literacy plans that are submitted annually to collect that information for you. I think that there's the general idea that the IRPs, as we watch the aggregate number of students that or the YTOP numbers fluctuate, that we can see those trend lines. Are the interventions working or not working? We do require that districts identify the interventions that they are using in their district and the training as identified as a requirement in the statute that their teachers or paraprofessionals or others that are working with students teaching reading have received. So I think we have some information about that.
No, I'm okay. Representative Connolly got the question.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I appreciate the difference between the IRP. I kind of have that mixed up. So are you good now? You guys are going to collect this data, or do we need to, I'm just going to be blunt, or do we need to write it into statute?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, I'm very happy to add data collection elements to the district literacy plans.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess, is there some simple math? I'm just trying to think if my student or my kids were identified as being below proficient. What is the step? I mean, if they're on the IEP, that makes sense, but is the IRP used as a bridge? I'm just trying to think, there's got to be some kind of number out there, like say half the kids in Wyoming are reading below the proficient level. And then there's a percentage of those kids that are in IEPs. In theory, the rest of them should all then be on an IRP. Does that make some sense? And I'm wondering if we can get some of those numbers.
Mr. Chairman and Senator, that would be one way to try to quantify that. We could certainly do that. It would be difficult again, though, to know which of the students on an IEP are receiving services for reading. I mean, we could make a generalization based on some national percentages. For example, the National Center for Educational Statistics report that nationally 35% of students identified for special education services are serviced under the label of specific learning disability. Our state's last count was 32.5%. If we extrapolate that backwards then of the number of students that have been identified on IEPs, we have around just under 4,400 students receiving services under that label. The National Institute of Health further believe that of those students that are identified under the SLD label, that between 75 and 80% of those are serviced under that label because of a reading challenge or disability. So if we extrapolate that, that would put Wyoming on the high end at the 80% end at around 3,500 students.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman? Just one follow-up. I think what would be helpful to know is how many kids maybe should be on an IRP versus how many kids actually are down the road.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I did want to follow up on that discussion with a concept that we've discussed over the years, the idea of effectively two models or two approaches, the severe discrepancy model for identification under IDEA and the response to intervention approach, which is the multi-tiered system of support, scaffolding, and the idea that we tend to contemplate these students are falling behind, and that's the traditional severe discrepancy models, 2 standard deviations behind, and then all of a sudden you qualify. But I think it's important for the committee to remember that the more modern, more appropriate approach is don't let them fall 2 standard deviations behind. That's a tremendous waste of resources. So you want to identify challenges while they're still at level. That means that it's a little harder to figure out the number, and that you actually have to find reading challenges through the screener type systems that say, all right, well, this student, even though they're at grade level, is confusing characters, or this student is not exhibiting these skills and they may need special assistance at this point in time. And the final point that the response to intervention tries to emphasize is you have a lot of students that are dyslexic, for example, that are even above grade level. They're exceptional students, and maybe eventually they'll fall behind if we don't stay ahead of the game. But they'll try and supplement because they are very intelligent. So that's a long way of saying it's far more complicated than just waiting for a low score. So as we contemplate identification, that's why this legislation was recrafted a couple of years ago to think, all right, we don't want to just wait for failure and then try to catch them back up. That never happens. That's like the worst approach you can have. You want to keep them and identify them as early as possible and keep them at grade level. So as we contemplate this, it isn't as simple as, well, what are the numbers? How many failed? If that's all we're doing, then we're not really succeeding at what is the more modern approach of this response to intervention. And there's a long introduction to the question of the use of RTI and multi-tiered system of supports in the state relative to severe discrepancy. It was my impression a number of years ago that a lot of districts still relied simply on identifying through 2 standard deviations behind and weren't taking this more modern approach. Are we seeing a significant transition towards RTI and multi-tiered system of supports throughout all of our districts, or is that still a selective district by district decision? What's the trend?
Mr. Chairman and Senator, so I think it's safe to say that most school districts continue to identify for special education student or services using the severe discrepancy model, but that most districts are implementing an MTSS and RTI system at the same time. So while they may not be using that RTI as the identification mode, they're using that as intervention prior to.
It's my understanding that IDEA would allow you to use an RTI recognition for an IEP. Is that accurate?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct.
Okay, and one more follow-up, but how many districts do we have? And you may not know this, but I'd be curious to know moving forward. So maybe at the next meeting or maybe by email, how many districts are using an RTI approach to identification in addition to, I'm sure they all use severe discrepancy as a baseline. Obviously, everyone's going to use that. But do we have any districts that are actively using RTI for IEP identification?
Mr. Chairman, I'll follow up and find that information.
We've got those categories and whatnot, but the statute does say that if they're not reading at grade level here, we've got to do one of these individualized reading plans, and I'm starting to get concerned that they're not doing it. The statute says that sets a goal of 85% of the students reading at grade level upon completion of 3rd grade. How many districts, if any, are achieving that goal at the current time?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know that we have any districts right now that are over the 85%. We have some that are in the 70%, more in the 60. So
That, okay. Representative Newsom, and then I want to come back to this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is, as I try to sort out in my brain the IEP, IRP. So if a student is on an IEP, which is the overarching individual plan for their education. And then if they're identified as having reading difficulty, is there a separate IRP nested in that IEP? Or is an IRP only for students who do not have an IEP? Is that a separate category? Or is there a nesting of an IRP into an IEP? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Newsom, that's a great question. So a student that qualifies for special education services and is receiving specially designed instruction around reading, that would be part of their IEP. So they would not have an IRP nested inside of that. That same student might have been receiving some reading intervention or tracking of their reading intervention in progress or lack thereof on an IRP prior to being identified as a student for special education services. But once that happens, and for a child that has reading disability or challenges, that IRP would go away and they would be serviced through the IEP.
So follow up, Mr. Chairman. So as we look at this, probably I'm thinking that all the students with an IEP are having some sort of reading difficulty, or a majority are having some sort of reading difficulty. And if that's true, then we need to include in these numbers that we're looking at, not only the IRPs, but the IEPs. Would that be a correct assessment?
Mr. Chairman and Representatives, so based on the percentages that the National Institute of Health report, they would suggest that most students that are receiving special education services are receiving them because of reading disability. But I don't know that I could over extrapolate that. There are a lot of other categories wherein students, or even in the specific learning disability, there's that smaller percentage then, either 15 to 20% of students that are not on an SLD, or not on an IEP under the category of severe learning discrepancy, that they would not be addressing reading challenges. It could be math, it could be executive functioning skills, it could be a host of other things.
I think we're starting to talk about some of the fundamentals that we're dealing with here. We heard the testimony that none of the districts are achieving the 85% proficiency level. That we have some in the 70s, but none in the 80s. And what that's saying to me is that we are leaving behind not learning how to read in the third grade. We're leaving behind at least 20% of the students, probably more like 25 or 30%. It seems to me that students that are not reading at grade level, as the statute is talking about, at the end of third grade, are in trouble that is going to be very difficult to, it can be overcome, but very difficult to overcome for the rest of their academic careers and their lives. And frankly, one of the questions I will pose to the committee is, should that goal be not 85%, but 95%? And the question is, what do we have to do so that we're getting all the students that we can up, and I'm hearing that there's a 0.5%. I'm hearing that there's 3 or 4%, I don't know what it is, that are physically and mentally incapable of reading at grade level. And that's a different problem. And I think we're probably handling that problem as well as can be. But the rest of them are just being left behind. And I think this is a definition of where, how much trouble we're in and how much improvement we need. Chairman Paxton, you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Drawing on my 34 years of experience in a K-12 school, I can tell you that you can't always legislate certain things. If you have a class of students in the kindergarten and 2 or 3 of them are not even potty trained, do you think that same parent is going to be reading to that child from the time they're an infant? There just are things that we have no control over. Unfortunately, the parenting styles of a lot of parents these days has declined considerably since we were children. We don't see that same level, and we can't legislate parental guidance. And so there just are some things we can't fix, and we have to accept that fact. Can we do a better job? You bet we can do a better job. And we ought to be looking for every opportunity to do that, in service to training our teachers better, all those kinds of things. But we're not going to change that situation at home, and we're never going to get to that 85, 90, 95% that we desire, because there are things that we don't have any control over. So my spiel for the day.
Mr. Chairman, one thought, though, that I think is important to contemplate as we look at that 85% number is that what we define as proficiency is up to us. And our proficiency that we're looking at is based on the result of a professional judgment panel that met a number of years in a row, developing cut scores in conjunction with the look at our standards to determine what was desired as an aspiration point for appropriate proficiency, exceeding expectation, meeting expectation, and not meeting expectation through the Education Accountability Act. One of the things we heard in testimony over that time from our consultants is that other states just set their standards lower and they have more proficient students. If you want 85%, we can get it. Just lower the bar. If you want 95%, we can get it. Just lower the bar. The challenge is I don't think that's consistent with any objective we actually have from a policy standpoint. We want continuous improvement. We want aspiration towards the high level, which is what we asked for the professional judgment panel. But the concern I have there is when we ask for exceptionally high standards that are some of the highest in the country in terms of achieving that proficiency, and then we effectively berate the education community for not achieving it, honestly, maybe they should have just set the bar lower and then we'd be lauding them for achieving their standard. And I think we need to be a little bit thoughtful and consistent in asking for high standards and then providing the tools to get there. The other thing with that 85% number, that was just an arbitrary number picked by legislators at some point in time and put in statute. We have a 14-ish% identification rate for special education throughout the state, year in, year out, every year, longer than I've been looking at the number. So 14 plus 85 is 99. There's not a lot of wiggle room there with that 85% number, recognizing that ongoing identification rate. So I think it's just important to kind of put that in context that we wrote all of the constraints and we over-constrained ourselves. That's not a bad thing because it's very aspirational, but the idea that we can up that number, we can, but then if we up that number to 95%, let's just go lower the bar so that we can achieve it. We have to recognize that there's a context here of what is and isn't achievable, and we writing unrealistic goals is not going to necessarily lead us to those goals. As Representative Paxton noted, there's a lot more to it, and that family dynamic and what's going on at home are things that are hard to legislate too. So I just wanted to make sure the committee was kind of aware of that history. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Solution, I don't want to adopt anything here, is to simply dumb it down. That would be a disgrace. I think that we really should be making an effort to reach, especially some of those children that are having problems at home, because this is their hope for having a successful life. And I think our professional panel did a good job in setting the standards, because those standards reflect what it's going to take to survive and succeed in our modern high-tech world. And I really think we need to see what we can do to get as many of these kids as possible up and reading. And I think that's the whole point of what this exercise we're indulging in is about. Get all those kids to the point where they can really succeed. And we're never going to get them all, as Chairman Paxton said, but we sure can do a lot better than we're doing now, I think. Representative Overton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question about the correlation or maybe even causation of all these individual programs related to class size. Could you talk about that in terms of the ability of a classroom teacher to actually provide individual teaching and class size? I know at one time we had the limitation to 16 students, and now we don't. So how do those two pieces fit together in your view? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Obermuller, I think it's generally accepted that a teacher with a smaller group of students is able to attend to and provide them more opportunities to respond, and therefore more opportunities for correction or reinforcement of a positive response. So as the numbers of students in our classes grow, those opportunities are limited. I would have to do some research to see if if I can find anything around class size and a correlation with proficiency outcomes.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, one of the issues that perhaps comes into play here is the actual ability to meet these individual education programs as class size goes up. It just, your logic of that is apparent. And yet it seems like we work against the individual program by driving up class size. So it seems like we have counterbalancing initiatives going on in the state. Do you say that? Do you see that? Does that sound like what's happening to you?
Mr. Chairman and Representative, that certainly seems like a logical takeaway. I think the other component that you mentioned several times is the teacher in the classroom and the skill set that the teacher has in being able to manage his or her responsibilities, and the skill set that they have developed to be able to teach literacy or any other skill to their student is really critical.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are there guidelines for how much individual instruction a teacher is supposed to give to individual students that are identified as special education students?
Mr. Chairman and Representative, so on a student who qualifies for special education services on their IEP, it's identified, the team has identified what the service is and how much time is required to provide that service at a level that will be meaningful and provide meaningful growth for that student.
Just one follow-up, Mr. Chairman. Being subject to federal regulations, are these set in federal regulation or are state regulation as to how much time a teacher should devote to an individual in the classroom?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, no, that's not, there are no guidelines for that. That's an IEP team decision.
Anybody else that we're gonna have?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Hamel, and excuse my frustration, but you're going to get a little bit of my frustration as we are an hour into the meeting and only on the third question, and it occurred to me that this is probably my sense of all of the WDE materials is a bit of frustration with not seeing answers to the questions that were posed, and then the recognition that honestly, you don't have those answers. You don't have them. But that being said, there was a desire, a sense of this body, the Education Committee in particular, the legislature in general, that we want to really help kids at the youngest age get to that reading proficiency. And I hear Senator Rothfuss saying we made up the 85%, but that was aspirational on our part for really good reasons. We want kids to succeed, and we understand that third grade reading is absolutely crucial. We also understand that we're spending a lot of money on IEPs and kids in special ed who are 2 standard deviations below the norm, which takes a tremendous amount of effort to change. That being said, we have so many different elements in our statutes that appear not to be followed. And that's my frustration. And the question is, what is the WDE doing in its role to get these statutes followed? And just putting it down to district level, it's all local control, to me isn't the answer. And that's honestly sometimes what I'm hearing. We're not collecting it. We don't know. It's up to the districts. Do we need to put things explicitly in statute and then hold the WDE and therefore districts accountable to those things? And just going to Representative Obermuller, the 15 to 1, 16 to 1 that we have in statute, right? Do we need to pull that out of the block grant? Right? So that instead of seeing, and I am appalled to hear that there's at least one district that has 38 kids in K through 5 on average, right? That is so far above what it is that we have decided, what all of the literature has said is beneficial for kids. What's going on in terms of our Title I schools? The questions that I asked earlier, are we seeing more success in those schools, which often have early childhood programs? They have pre-K programs in them. I want to know, are they successful? Should we be replicating them elsewhere? We don't have the answers. You know, I've been an advocate for early childhood education since I've been on this committee. You know that, right? Every bit of national data indicate that it helps. We have the possibility of having some data to indicate what's happening in Wyoming, but we don't have it, right? We need you to be our partner. So my question after that rant is, are you willing to be our partners? Get us this information that we need so that we can develop the best possible program for our youngest citizens in the state. Because if the answer is no, you know, honestly, that it's not in your bailiwick, we can put things in statute, and we will. But we have believed you when you say that you will collect data, that you will report to us, then we see answers like this, right? It's not enough to me. So the question again is, are you willing to be our partners?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly, that's a big question as well, with lots of layers. I believe that we are willing to be your partners. I think I've already expressed a willingness to add those data collection elements to the district literacy plans that are required in hopes of having better data for you.
I would add, I think Representative Connolly is speaking for the whole committee on this one. And I think it goes beyond just data. We're looking for some professional advice from the Department of Education to help us improve what we're doing in our schools so that we get a higher percentage that are in fact reading and succeeding. And I think that's what we're after. And we're a bit disappointed in what we're seeing so far. Okay, with that, I'd like to say thank you very much. We'll call up University of Wyoming, next group in the agenda. To come on up and help us.
Her agenda's not finished.
Are you have some more? Did we cut you off too quick?
Mr. Chairman, I can certainly finish the
Okay.
memo that I provided, or
Okay, if you, I thought you were finished. Oh. Okay, excuse me, University.
Mr. Chairman, the next question on the memo was, is there data to illustrate that individualized education programs have been reduced by early intervention? And I'll try to answer more succinctly. You have information in writing here, and I think there's been a lot of research across the country that seeks to answer that question in a variety of ways. I've selected two different studies to share, but there are numerous studies out there. In the first one, there was a statement in that research that said, in that study that said research in the effectiveness of early intervention and the impact on young children has been plentiful and generally has noted positive effects on learning as well as behavior. You'll see that repeated over and over in seemingly numerous reports. So this specific one, I chose to include simply because they quantified the amount of early intervention time and in two different subgroups of children. So one with 25 hours, coming to a center-based, another group with children receiving home-based services for 3 hours a week. And then those same students, what were the results by the time those children reached middle school? For the students receiving the 25 hours a week early intervention, they were identified at, for special education services by middle school at a 14% rate compared to the students that received lesser interventions or only 3 hours a week of early intervention. They were identified at a higher rate for special education services at 30%. The second research article that I shared was selected because it was more of a meta-analysis, and they felt that their results or overview of these studies led to statistically, significant reduction in special education, a reduction in grade retention, and an increase in high school graduation as demonstrated by the early interventions that were provided in these various studies. Those that they reviewed. Those articles are available through the links that are there. I also wanted to say that in another report that was completed by the Education Commission of the states, that it was estimated that the return on investment in pre-kindergarten ranged from anywhere from $2 per dollar to $13 spent on, and that range was strongly influenced by the quality of the programs or the intervention. They went on to share some specific examples of what other states reported, and they showed that Massachusetts reported saving over $2,700 per child in 1 year after deducting the cost of the early intervention. Florida reported a net savings of $20,000, almost $21,000 per child over the 20 years that they were tracking. Montana reported that 36% of their students who received early intervention programs no longer received or required special education services by second grade. That's a big, I think that's a really notable achievement, and that the another 33% of their students required only limited services. So I think it would be hard to argue that early intervention is not critical. And potentially it needs to start before kindergarten. So the next question was, what school districts have applied to the WDE for the Comprehensive Literacy State Development subgrants from USAID? And those are listed with the amounts that each individual district applied for. We are preparing to roll the second level of grant applications out shortly. The next question was what screening programs and assessments are being used by school districts? And in reporting through the district literacy plans that are required annually, there were a total of 24 different screening instruments reported, with the three most common as identified as Fastbridge, Dibbles, and Ames Web. I want to note that many districts identify using multiple screeners. And with the assessment instruments, there were at least 27 different assessment instruments reported. And the three most commonly were identified as YTOP, NWA MAP, and Fastbridge. And again, many districts report using more than one. And then the question of that was lingering was what are the cut scores on YTOP and YALD assessment for reading proficiency? And that information is provided in the table. And I think Senator Rothfuss has added a lot of commentary to that as well. Just a reminder that these are set and that they don't change year to year, and that they are based on standards and performance level descriptors. With that, I'm happy to answer any other questions or make space for the University of Wyoming.
Representative Paxton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not a question, but just a comment. As I stated earlier, there just are things that we don't have any control over that really impact this whole business that we're talking about. But there are some things that we do have some control over. And the key to providing our kids the best opportunities we can is to have the best teacher in the classroom that you can. So you back that up one notch, and that means that you need to have a principal who's doing the hiring that understands the value of this business that we've been talking to and hires highly qualified teachers. And when they're doing their evaluation on those teachers, they need to identify any deficiencies that teacher may have and provide the resources that they need to bring them up to speed. They also need to provide the classroom resources that are needed, paraprofessionals, whatever it takes, so that you can divide those kids into different reading groups and do all the things that you need to do that really brings about a successful conclusion to that. So, and the other big key thing is, and we've touched on it a little bit here, keeping that classroom size small. There are so many things that you can do with that smaller class size, especially in that K3 area. It's just crucial that we do that. And that's something that we probably need to follow through on, and whatever it takes to make sure that we are adhering to that maximum of 16-1 in that K3 thing. We need to take that action. So that's the summary of where I'm coming from. Thank you.
Let me follow up by asking Representative Paxton a question. My late wife, physical therapist, worked for a while in the school system. And she used to tell me that you could walk into a building and tell whether that school was being successful or not, just the atmosphere and the leadership. She said it was the leadership the principal provided. In your experience and judgment, is that an accurate assessment?
I would say that would be a very accurate assessment. And I've said that, that the principal is probably the most important person in that whole chain of things, because they hire teachers, they out-counsel teachers, and they evaluate teachers. And so if you have a principal who has high standards, that really has the kids' best interests at heart, you're going to have a good school.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one quick clear up here. Just remind me again on what schools have applied for the CLCSD grants. Remind me again what they were supposed to be using that for, and they applied for that. What is that supposed to go towards?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Nyman, those funds are for to be utilized in the way that the district wants to revamp their literacy program. So we have some districts that want additional training. We have some districts that are wanting to take their first year to complete a comprehensive needs assessment. Maybe have some outside experts come in and assist, put together a program. It could include the purchase of new curricular items. It could, like I said, training. It could be short-term because the funds do sunset, increase of personnel, which is problematic for districts. You don't want to bring in too many people that you can't continue to pay, but it could be training for those teachers as well, to be able to provide better services. So it's a wide range based on what the district proposed.
One follow-up, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ms. Hamel, do you see a correlation between the districts that are maybe struggling with districts that are actually asking for these funds in an effort to try to upgrade their programs? And is there a correlation? Do you see districts that are kind of where they're at as far as their data shows their reading comprehension or the reading readiness? Are those districts that are doing a good job, let's say, or are scoring higher, asking for these dollars, or do you see districts that are maybe struggling being more inclined to ask for these dollars in an effort to try to improve their program?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, it's a mixture. Mhm.
Representative Summers and then Representative.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this question may be for staff and it could be for Shelley. And then a follow-up. So obviously districts, you have your class size, but districts also have reading interventionists, right? So my sister was a reading teacher for 20 some years. And so how are reading interventionists resourced in the block grant in the lower grades? So that question's for Matt.
Mr. Chairman, I would point to two components within your, maybe even three components within your block grant. One would be tutors. So school districts are resource tutors on the basis of their at-risk proxy count, and then also the size of the school. The second resource I would point to is your extended day and summer school component. Those are resources for additional time for students to partake in programs, particularly areas where they're struggling. And then the third area would be for English language learners. So students who would need assistance in that area as well. Those are the three primary areas, in addition to your core teachers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And if my memory serves me correct, and I'm probably going to forget one of the three, but at risk includes ELL, it includes free and reduced, and it includes mobility. Is that correct? And so, Mr. Chairman, what it doesn't include is how many kids are on an IRP, for example. So, and there may not be a standard for how you create an IRP or what kid belongs to an IRP. And so, I think this goes back to my question to WDE is you do have broad authority, back to Representative Conley's question, is when we look at this holistically, how are we going to improve things? And I think hopefully what comes out of this is we put our heads towards this and you all put your heads towards this. For example, how many kids is any one reading interventionist doing? So perhaps one in Cheyenne's, I don't know, maybe they got 100, maybe they got 50 kids. Maybe they're so overloaded that they can't do an adequate job, even though they're a good reading teacher, with the children they do have. So, and obviously this may cost more money, but maybe an at-risk for a tutor should include a kid that's not able to read. And how do we if that's absolutely at risk, right? So my question to you is that something we could perhaps do, is throw that measure into into how you determine how many tutors a school's eligible for, by saying that a kid that's on an IRP, but we have to have some standard for that, right? I mean, it's easy to determine out with free and reduced lunch. It's easy to determine some of these other factors. But I think we got to get down to how do you resource that teaching interventionist? Is that something that you would agree with or disagree with?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Summers, I think that's up to you. Certainly, anytime that you carve out something in the block grant for a specific purpose, one would assume that it's getting used that way. But really, that's up to you.
I would put a comment that I think as I read the statute, there is a standard for who belongs on an individual reading plan. And it's that they're not reading at grade level in these early grades. And that statute is, that's what I read the statute being. The IEP serves as that when they qualify for an IEP, so we don't duplicate. But it's a much broader standard than the IEP. So I think that is the standard in the statute. Representative Conley, I believe you were next.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hamel, when I think back to the questions that we asked last time, and it included the list of schools that receive the federal money, the literacy money, and I'm going to follow up, I think, on Representative Nyman's question. We wanted to know those in part to understand who was asking for the money and what they were going to do, exactly what you asked. But you answered. But the depth to that question was, why didn't other districts ask for the money? It would seem to me that every district, and so this is my question, was every district eligible? Did you, as the WDE, help districts in terms of applying for this grant money? This, to me, as you indicated, was money that was available for exactly what the purpose of our statutes are in terms of early intervention. And we only have a handful of, honestly, they look like pretty small districts that applied for and got this money. So I'd like to know more about the districts that aren't listed here and what was the WDE's role in helping them, and if they can still apply.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Connolly, so absolutely, districts are able to continue to apply. We have 8.6 million per year for 4 more years. We would love to have those funds in the hands of districts. And I think that the reason that more districts did not apply is because, and this is just my opinion, but based on comments that I hear, their capacity is really spent right now dealing with COVID, having all of the influx of the ESSER funds to try to manage as well. There's a capacity issue. Yes, indeed, we are willing to participate. We are also, I know that the university was willing to participate in assisting districts. And I know that we pre-approved a list of external providers to also assist districts in being able to pull together a program or a grant application. All 8 that were submitted, not all 8 started out approvable, but by the time that we finished working with those districts, they absolutely were. Again, we'll send out that additional opportunity over and over until we continue to hopefully expend those funds where they should be expended. 95% of the grant has to be utilized at the district level. I want to also, I guess this is absolutely my opinion when I share this, but we have a capacity problem at our agency, not in people's lack of willingness, but we don't have enough people. I can't run all of the COVID funds and this at a high quality level, plus my other responsibilities. We don't have a position identified for this that's funded.
Mr. Chairman, follow up. Okay. Ms. Hamel, I want the money spent. We all want that money spent, and we want it going into those classrooms to help kids. What is it that you need to be able to help districts to push out this money to help kids? You said you had 95%, that other 5%. Can you hire whoever it is that you need? Is that what you need in order to do this work?
So, Mr. Chairman, Representative, so the grant application identified 2 positions to add. So we have 2 individuals working on AWACS. Right now we have 1 that's vacant. We had 1 person start with us and then return to the district. And so we are looking to interview next week to refill that position. So those 2 positions are funded for this work. For the district literacy plan and the data collection and some other things like that you're asking of me, there is no position. There is not an ongoing team or such that works with that. So we continue to pull time from other, from folks that have a little bit here and there.
Mr. Chairman, may I follow up?
Yes.
Okay, Ms. Hamilton, I'd like to make a request that you come back to us for our November meeting and you give us an update with a goal. And the goal is that we double the number of districts that have successfully applied for the use of this money. And I'm sorry, but on one hand, that means that you need to perhaps reprioritize some of the work that goes on and hire that additional AWAC as soon as possible. But this is a priority and there's some resources out there and we don't want to lose them. And so I would like to hear by November a status report.
And let me, I think it's expensive, maybe that this whole business of teaching kids how to read in these first 3 grades is right at the top of our priority list as legislators in the legislation that we passed, our predecessors have passed, reflects that. And I hope the department will take that to heart. That's at the center of what we're trying to accomplish. Let me ask a very simple question. This list of districts and the amounts applied for, what's the total amount of that list, do you know?
I have not added it up. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Well, we will do that. I think it's less than what's available. Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to ask a question, and Shelley, you touched on it briefly, about your staffing levels and the ability of what your staff has and through budget cuts and like this. And one of the things that came up as I've been processing what's been discussed up here is back in 2017 and 2018, my first 2 years in the legislature, we went through a pretty in-depth review of a lot of reporting requirements from districts to the state and the state back to us. And we cleaned a lot of that up. We cleaned up a whole bunch of administrative functions that frankly, that at the time, I think there's probably 3, maybe 4 of us on this committee that served during that time on this committee. And we understood what we were pulling out and what we were putting back in. What I'm hearing this committee was frustrated about now is that we're not collecting enough data. We're not getting enough data. But what I'm also hearing from you is you don't have the staff. Even if you had the staff, we've kind of cleaned up that data pulling back from you guys. So I'm just kind of curious your perspective. This is much more as the chief academic officer. What is your perspective on collecting that amount of data at the will of the legislature? When we've said clean up and stop collecting this much data, we don't really use all that much data. I feel like maybe we're tossing mixed signals at you guys by telling you we want to clean this up and we don't want these administrative tasks burdening the districts and you guys because you don't have enough staff. But then we turn around and we hammer you guys when you guys come up here saying you're not collecting enough data. I feel like we're doing that to you guys, but I also need to know what the right balance is and how do we get to that right balance, not only for your sake and for the school district's sake, but for our students' sake. How do we identify them and how do we know that what we're asking for is the right information?
Mr. Chairman and Representative, I think that's a hard balance to strike. Absolutely. I think that the reason that we all looked at what are the reporting requirements because we heard extensive testimony from school districts that this isn't, this is a burden. It's not necessary information. It's equally difficult to prepare and to know or to project. Sometimes it's not as difficult as others, but sometimes it is difficult to project what question is going to come and what piece of data is really going to answer that question. And so that's frequently challenging. So I feel like sometimes, as you stated, we're kind of caught in the middle of trying to find this perfect balancing act. I believe that everybody's working really hard for the same outcome. Everyone recognizes the absolute critical need for students to be able to read by the end of 3rd grade. And it's been noted by several people that when a child is behind, they don't catch up. And so if they come into kindergarten behind, they're not catching up likely. Data would not suggest that they close that gap. It's really, really difficult. And so we're trying to balance what data helps us to identify then, what needs to be done, what data is overburdensome. That's a hard balance to strike. Right now, really grateful to have this federal grant, because we do have a couple of positions that are able to help work on this most important initiative. So we're really happy to see that. So, we're in the middle of September. I'm not sure that we can run a grant application and have 8 more districts on board by November, but we'll certainly give it our best.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Shelley, I guess my follow-up question to that would be, are we collecting the right data to get us the information that this committee is looking for on K-3 reading? Because when we had this issue happen, a few years ago, this initiative nearly died. I mean, it was nearly eliminated from statute, let alone the fact that we're going to collect some of the data. So what data do we need to be asking in statute for you to ask for the districts to make sure that we're getting the information that we're looking for?
Mr. Chairman, I think that I have a list of elements that are clearly we need to understand, and I think we can build that into the district literacy reporting plan that districts are required to submit. Outside of that, you would have to identify what else do we need, right? I mean, it's hard for me to project what do you want to know? So that's difficult, but I have quite a scattered list here.
I would add to that as important as the data is, one of the things we're really looking for, and I'm not seeing, is a professional understanding of what the data we do have is telling us. And that's something we do expect out of the Department of Education, to get some good professional advice on what we've got, what we know. And we do know a lot from the assessment testing and from a number of the other things. What's it telling us? And that's the piece that I'm seeing that I'm not satisfied with. Representative Nyman, you had, okay.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier, I talked about the correlation of time and student number of students and the time availability to teachers to address these individual issues. The other piece of what I'd like to ask about is in relation to the well, my thought has passed, so I'll have to come back to you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry.
Thank you. Down here at the kids' table. Mr. Chairman, my question goes back to class size. I know we've talked a lot about it. Now we have a lot of data and I'm going through it as we speak, 254 pages worth on this WDE report. The data shows that we pay obviously at 16:1. The data also shows that the average class size is nowhere near that, especially in elementary school. It's set average is 19. Going through on district by district, I don't see very many schools that are even close to 16. We've talked a lot about K-3, and that's the sweet spot where we need to be for reading and get as many teachers as possible in that area. The data doesn't say why there's 609 fewer elementary school teachers than what the block grant, what we're paying for. We're not getting what we're paying for, but it doesn't say why. Is it because the buildings aren't set up properly to be able to break, say, 50 kids into 3 classes of 16? Or is it just the school districts deciding, yeah, we'll do 2 classes of 25 and we'll pocket the rest of the money and we'll use it for something else? That's what I'd like to know. Why is it that we're not seeing what we're paying for. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Beitman, I've heard school districts testify to the idea that there are many unfunded responsibilities that they have in a school district. And so that may be influencing their ability. They still have to pay for these things, but maybe there's not a funding component for that in the block grant. And so that may be influencing that. But they could probably answer that question better than I can.
Let me throw something out for you to think about. We had and I didn't do the analysis myself. It was done by another senator who's not on this committee, but took the crew report and said, what's happening to the money? And the answer he came up with is we're spending more in administration, both in terms of numbers of people and in terms of salaries. We're spending more on athletics, and we may have some expertise in the committee on that than the model calls for. And we're spending more in some cases on salaries. And I'm not clear, I think it's the more senior teachers, but I'm not clear about that. And in that order. And I don't know whether that analysis is correct or not, but that's what he came up with looking at the crew report. And that is something we're going to have to think about.
To address that, it's the reverse order that dominates so we have a model that produces a certain number of teachers with a model salary, and then that's distributed to the districts and block grant. The model salary does not reflect real salaries, and that's the driving factor for most of the funding, like 60 or 70% of the model probably goes to those teachers' salaries. So when you use real salaries and then have a certain amount of money with the real salaries, you end up cutting the number of teachers because you're constrained on the total amount of dollars. So that's been the situation for as long as I've been working in recalibration, but it has been exacerbated. 7 years ago, there was the legislative grace that was put in 12 years ago that provided additional resources to compensate for that so that you could get to the 16-to-1 at the lower grades. Over the last 5 to 7 years, that legislative grace has narrowed to the point where the model is on model now. So there is not excess funding, where that excess funding did pay the gap to a large degree for teacher salaries. It's not there anymore. So you can see classroom size increase over the last 5 years. If you look at the trend line, particularly in the K through 3 level, but throughout you'll see the class sizes increase. And in fact, 10-ish years ago, those K3 class sizes really were down close to 16-to-1. They didn't necessarily achieve it, but remember that was in statute, that if you didn't achieve 16-to-1, you had to file an exception waiver request with the Department of Education, along with a justification for why you were going to fail to achieve a 16-to-1 aggregate classroom size in K3. And it was always accepted. There were always excuses, but it certainly kept the focus on keeping those classrooms small. In 2017, the legislature decided, I think via an amendment in a bill, although there were some pieces of legislation floating around, but it got folded into another piece of legislation, to remove that obligation because it was seen as a reporting requirement, effectively. That was kind of how it was argued. Well, this is just unnecessary reporting because we grant all waiver requests. So let's not have that waiver request needed. And then that piece of statute, which is referenced here, 2113-307 A Romanet 4, went away, but with it, the obligation for the K3. So we no longer get the data, there's no longer the obligation, and there's no longer a reason for an explanation if you go over your size on the K3. So that's kind of how we are where we are and why we are where we are, at least in the recent history, is a combination, I think, of those two. With regard to administration, aggregate, the administrative salaries and the administrative expenditures are higher than model, but it's not that substantial relative to teacher salaries. And activities are again higher, but it's, across the entire model, it ends up being 15 million out of the 1.5 billion or something like that. It doesn't end up being the key driver. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
We are starting to get
Agreed.
and I want to get us back on track.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick note on the 16-1, and I don't disagree with what the good senator said. However, one of the reasons was 16-1 was also pushing the facility size and what our obligations were with facilities. And I think that was some of the reason that 16-1 went away.
Just to clarify that was typically the reason given on the waiver request, is that we didn't have the buildings to meet the 16-1. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Apologize for the senior moment there earlier. Seems like I'm having senior months now instead of senior moments sometimes. I do have the other piece of the teacher component, the 16-1. The other piece of that is the continuing professional education piece of it that I wanted to ask about in terms of what the department's leverage is to address the professional education component of the teachers even being able to teach reading properly, and what the status of that is, what's your role in that? How much authority do you have in that area? What you provide, those kind of questions. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Obermueller, our role in that is limited because the PTSB oversees the licensing. And their, statutes and rules and regulations would govern the required recertification time and any specific requirements.
Just one follow-up. Rather than the certification piece, maybe just a general education piece of the training of teachers. What is your role in that in terms of training of teachers, or do you have a role?
Again, Mr. Chairman and Representative, our role is offering professional development. Like I said before, the licensure requirements are by PTSB, that initial licensure requirement and then ongoing requirement. So the ongoing professional development hours and things. Our role in that is that we provide opportunities for professional development that then turn into hours that they can report to PTSB to be able to recertify or relicense.
At this point, welcome. Introduce yourself.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, Chairman Scott. Good morning. I am Scott Thomas. I am the John P. Jack Elbogen Dean of the College of Education at the University of Wyoming. With me today, I have brought 3 of the nation's experts in literacy to bring a little insight into our programs and to the Literacy Research Center and Clinic. Along with us today, we also have Provost and Executive Vice President Kevin Carmen behind me over my left shoulder, and we have Vice President Kyle Moore over my right shoulder on this side. So we got quite the contingent here. Thank you for the time and thank you for the opportunity to bring some of our experiences to bear on this very, very important conversation.
And let me say, welcome all the university people, and we're just really gratified that the university is being supportive in our efforts to improve what we think is a good school system, but always need to improve.
Well, thank you, Chairman Scott. And we are arm in arm with you on the objective of being second to none in public education in Wyoming. And to the point of the earlier conversation, this is going to require a lot of partnership, and it's going to require a lot of working with one another to recognize our mutual expertise and our individual excellence in this process. So we look forward to that.
I would say that a few years ago, President Penn at the university said that there is no reason Wyoming cannot have the best public education system in the United States, K through graduate school. Y'all are a very important part of that. So I think you really set a proper goal.
Well, thank you, Chairman Scott. I will let my colleagues introduce themselves in a moment. I want to touch on three guiding principles for our work and what really constitutes our contribution to that goal of being second to none nationally. And that's not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is our young people and in our state learning and having an education system that is supportive of a diversified and sustainable economy. The three priorities, three principles that guide us are: first, every child in Wyoming deserves an excellent teacher. This is not news, but these are our operating principles. That is the first priority. Second principle is that every teacher in Wyoming deserves a competent, expert, caring, motivated school leader. That's a principal and a superintendent, to the points that were made earlier. And thank you very much, Chairman Paxton, for making that point so powerfully. And then the third piece is that the third principle they're operating with is that every teacher and every principal deserves ongoing professional learning opportunities across their career. And I think oftentimes when we think about the University of Wyoming, we think about training educators and preparing educators for the classrooms. Those are novice educators. They make up a small proportion of the overall workforce of educators in the state. And almost half of the teachers in Wyoming schools hold a degree from the University of Wyoming. So our work is not just to graduate incoming cohorts, it's to support the entire system toward everyone becoming a master teacher of sorts in their craft. And that requires a community to do that. So with that opening set of remarks, let me turn to my colleagues and give them a moment to introduce themselves, if that's acceptable to you, Chairman Scott. Okay.
Hello, it's a privilege to be here. My name is Cindy Brock. I serve as one of your endowed chairs in literacy in the state of Wyoming. I started teaching in 1981 in an elementary school. I currently serve on the board of directors for the major literacy research organization in the US, and it's a privilege to be here.
Thank you. I'm Amy Spiker, and I am the Executive Director of the Literacy Research Center and Clinic on the university campus.
Good morning. I'm Lee Hall. I am one of the Wyoming Excellence Endowed Chairs in Literacy Education, and I work a lot with teachers on how to meet the needs of students who are struggling to meet those grade level expectations in reading. Sorry, Lee, L-E-I-G-H, Hall, H-A-L-L.
Thank you, Chairman Scott. With those introductions, again, you have three of the nation's experts in literacy, particularly at the levels that we're talking about this morning. We have three objectives today. The first is to provide an overview of our educator preparation programs, specifically as they relate to literacy. There were a number of suggestions made at the last meeting that weren't directly on point in terms of what we do, and we'd like just to be on the record of offering you an overview of exactly what it is we do in this area in our educator preparation programs. The second is to provide the committee and the public with an introduction to the Literacy Research Center and Clinic. And Dr. Spiker is the director of the LRCC, and Dr. Spiker will be leading the presentation this morning. And then finally, we'd like to offer a few observations about the conversation around dyslexia and the role of literacy and dyslexia and some other areas of learning disability. We had one colleague that was unable to make it at the last moment. Tiffany Hunt is a professor of special education. She will be part of this team and be available to the committee to provide expertise from the special education perspective on that front. Mr. Chairman, with that said, if it is acceptable to you, I will ask Dr. Spiker to proceed with our brief presentation, and then we can open it up for questions if that's your preference. Thank you.
Probably get questions as you go,
Okay.
given the degree of interest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did want to start with a little bit of context. I am a product of Wyoming schools. I am a 3-time graduate of the University of Wyoming, very proud of that, and a proud teacher educator now at the University of Wyoming. When I graduated high school and I knew I wanted to be a teacher, I sought out resources to be able to go to college and attend college, and the Wyoming legislature provided me with a scholarship. At that time was called the Superior Students in Education Scholarship. So I was able to go to the University of Wyoming, and then my agreement was to teach in Wyoming for 3 years and give back. I have far exceeded that, took a little bit of a break, went to New Mexico and Wisconsin and Arizona, but was very excited and happy to return home and have dedicated myself to that goal of not only being an excellent teacher that was placed upon me, but also to raise excellent teachers for Wyoming. So I do want to talk to you a little bit today, first of all, about our program and what we do to prepare pre-service teachers for teaching literacy in the state. And next slide. Thanks. So what we do at the University of Wyoming in terms of preparing our literacy teachers is that we look at the National Reading Panel's 5 big ideas. We consider all the current research that is out there on best practices for readers and writers. There, thank you. And we do also include that large body of research that has commonly become known as the science of reading. What is out there that says what is a best practice for helping a young reader? We work to help the novice teachers understand literacy development, starting from oral language development up into content area, discipline area, reading and writing. And we support them as they transition into their field experiences, and we help them put that learning into place in practice and instruction. Next slide. We also work with them to help them collect assessment data, to analyze that data, and to prepare instruction that would be deemed appropriate. So helping them again with what they will be doing as a teacher, looking at assessment data, planning instruction that's appropriate for students. We work with them to begin to work in collaborative communities of practice that they will be involved in their schools. And we provide them with a solid foundation for teaching literacy, both the underlying research and theory. Next slide. There are things we don't do. We don't prepare novice teachers to teach a particular program or curriculum. Curriculums change regularly. Programs are adopted, readopted, and adjusted. Teachers teach children, and their programs and the curriculums are the tools. And so what we strive to do is to teach pre-service teachers the foundations of what good literacy instruction is, so that they are well equipped to teach any program or curriculum that their district has adopted. Next slide. To give you just some context in terms of looking at this grade 3 proficiency, we do recognize, and we talk to pre-service teachers repeatedly about the importance of developing oral language and getting that oral language foundation and how essential that is. Looking at the multiple longitudinal studies that link early learning experiences and academic outcomes as have been discussed today, and that important investment in early childhood education that has also been discussed today. Next slide. So in terms of our program, throughout a student's university experience in the education program, they will receive 150 hours of literacy instruction. That is through coursework, that's through field work, that's through their residency program when they're doing their student teaching. So they have coursework in oral language development, they have coursework in different levels of literacy, and including and incorporating how to use children's literature in their teaching. They have 2 separate method courses, and they will soon, that will be divided into early elementary and upper elementary. And they also will be taking a diagnosing reading difficulties course. And I say they will be because in response to feedback and in response to knowing the changing needs of both our state and our country in terms of early reading. We have responded by developing a new reading program that is being phased in now, where students will have a reading diagnosis course and look at different reading difficulties. And they will also be separating out early and upper elementary to get that focus on that K-3 instruction.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So through the course of the last couple of weeks, we've got a lot of letters from various publics and teachers about issues. And so one thing I want to understand is, okay, so an elementary teacher would have to have how many hours of education totally? So is it 120, whatever that is? And then actually how many hours, I don't want to know residency, right? That's kind of a cop-out. So I want to know how many hours of actual instruction they get on literacy out of that 120 elementary teachers.
Yeah. In the elementary program, they would take a 3-hour course in oral language acquisition. They would take a 3-hour course in early literacy. They would take a 3-hour course in children's literature. And then they would take currently take a 5-hour methods course.
So, Mr. Chairman, just a quick follow-up. So 14 hours out of 120
Currently.
And the question I'll throw back to you, maybe you know the answer, maybe you don't, but you can find out, is if you look around the nation at other elementary school programs, what do they provide for literacy instruction out of their base number of hours? And how do we compare to the best of the best that are educating teachers in America?
What we offer currently is very similar. What we are planning to offer and what is being phased in is actually above what most of our comparator universities would have.
And just a quick follow-up, Mr. Chairman, if we could get that data from other states or other college universities and who are the best of the best. So who's considered the best in literacy in the United States in the universities, and what do they provide? I'd really like to see that information. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I just want to be clear that we're talking about credit hours, not actual class hours there. And so a 3-hour course is roughly 40 hours of instruction. A 3-credit course. Okay.
Presentation, all done. You warn up when I ask you, we're hearing a lot from school districts that they prefer graduates of Chapman State, Black Hills State, University of Wyoming. Yeah. Many teachers argue that. As to the extent the presentation doesn't cover, what are you going to do so that Wyoming can place the first choice rather than the current situation? You know, you're brand new. I know you're trying to reform things. So I'm interested in exactly what you're planning to do to solve what we're hearing. So proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Slide, please. Thank you. So again, they're getting their coursework in oral language, introductory courses, and incorporating children's literature. And then we do provide students with opportunities for some tutoring of students that are struggling in reading and in writing in the Literacy Research Center and Clinic. Next slide. Our faculty are national board certified teachers, they're researchers, the practitioners, wealth of experience. We're accredited through a rigorous national process, and we are also working toward being recognized by the International Literacy Association for our undergrad course to receive national recognition. As the dean indicated, half of Wyoming's current K-12 teachers are our graduates. In terms of the praxis results for the praxis test that students are asked to pass in order to be licensed in the state, we have an 80% pass rate, and of that 80%, there are some retakes. However, the amount of retakes in literacy are very a majority of students that pass that on the first attempt. They also take an EdTPA performance-based assessment that they teach a literacy lesson. They observe themselves teaching, they reflect, and they submit a portfolio. The average score for our students in literacy is 38.6 as an overall score, and national recommended performance is 37 to 42. So we're right in the national range. Next slide.
I'm gonna stop you right there.
Mhm.
ETPA. This committee is blaming not, we have some professional experience, but most of us are not. And these acronyms and abbreviations get to us sometimes. What is happening?
Yes, Mr. Chair. It is the educational teaching portfolio assessment. And so students design 3 to 5 continuous lessons based upon a literacy strategy that they are focusing on. They teach that lesson and record it. They reflect upon that lesson, and then they talk about the changes that they would make according to their students' needs and looking at the assessments that they give. And then they submit all of that to a national scoring area. Thank you. Next slide. So our Literacy Research Center and clinic is housed at the University of Wyoming, and we work very hard to disseminate literacy knowledge and evidence-based practices across the state. We offer professional development for in-service practicing teachers. We have a clinical setting that we can help prepare pre-service teacher candidates, and we serve as a hub for research. We have research going on with faculty continuously, and we really strive towards statewide engagement. And that's a thread that runs through all that we do. Next slide. Some of the sample projects, we are currently in a partnership with McCrell, and you're going to ask me that acronym, and I have it written down somewhere. But we are working with them and with the WDE to provide K-3 reading support in Fremont County. And we also are working not with McCrell, but we are also working with the Y-Belt subgrant that was discussed with Bighorn Schools K-12. We partnered with Albany County School District this past summer to run a summer school for 62 students K-5 and worked solely on literacy during that summer school session. We do provide tutoring locally in Laramie at this point, although now the pandemic has shown us that we can do it virtually as well. We have our special education faculty, including Dr. Hunt, who was not able to be here today, that is developing some Alexa skills for parents to get more information on dyslexia and to help students be supported at home. We are developing early childhood modules to support early childhood teachers in their training. And we are currently developing some principal leadership modules in literacy so that principals can take these modules so they know what to look for when they're evaluating teachers who are teaching literacy, so they can go in and look for those key ideas and key areas. We are developing a podcast that we hope to use to disseminate research, and we have run book and research study groups for teachers and professionals in education. Yes.
Area, is it not?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I hear some, Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Ms. Spiker. It's nice to meet you in person. Just for the committee's knowledge, years ago, I remember when the LRCC created an advisory board, and it was co-chaired by Judy Catchpole and First Lady Mead. And at the time, I was not serving in the legislature, but was involved in a number of things and had kids in our public schools. So I was asked to serve as an advisory board member. And it is kind of funny to see, the more years you do this kind of stuff, on page 8 of your slides, it talks about the mission of the LRCC, serving as the epicenter. This was all words we helped craft, and then serving as the hub for cutting edge research. So I'm just enjoying kind of seeing the back end of all of that work. But I think what I missed in the presentation from the first part of the slides, though, was what exactly kids are learning. Because years ago when we worked, and it was Representative and then Speaker Harshman who brought a bill to exempt school districts from certain screening, like prescribed screening tools that were being used through YTOP and wanting to use something else. And so it really sparked this whole conversation about how we screen and what teachers are being taught. And so after a lot of work on both the House and Senate side, we landed with the legislation that passed. I thought it was a good piece of work, but I started asking the question of, are we giving teachers the right tools? And to illustrate this, I mean, just the other day, my daughter wanted to plant a tree and she went to the garage to grab a shovel, and she grabbed a snow shovel, and she was in our backyard trying to dig, and she wasn't getting very far, and she was getting really frustrated, and she was trying. But it wasn't until I said, that's not the right tool. You need this shovel. And so that's my concern is like, I have no doubt that our teachers are hardworking, committed individuals. The question is, are we giving them the right tool? And so at the time that we worked on this legislation, I started becoming aware of this literacy war, and that teachers were only being taught one method or one theory of how to learn how to teach, how to read. And so that's been my concern is I think multiple methods should be taught, and then empowering teachers to have more tools. And so that's, I guess, my question is, what are we teaching teachers? Are we teaching them the whole word? And I always botch the terms, but what are we teaching? Whole language, thank you, or more, or something else? I'm just curious, like, can we put a finer point on that? And that's a huge concern of mine.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Ellis, thank you. We are striving to provide a very well-rounded foundation based upon the findings of the National Reading Panel report. So we prepare our pre-service teachers to look at those 5 key components. I humbly make them look at Spiker 6 components because I think writing needs to be addressed as well, and it's a reciprocal skill. So the students that are in our methods courses will learn, as they will start talking about oral language development and phonemic awareness, and how important phonemic awareness is to the youngest of our readers. Then they will learn about phonics, and they will learn about systematic explicit phonics instruction, because research says that that is definitely a key component. And they will learn about that. They will learn about moving on to fluency and developing fluent readers. They will learn about comprehension and how important it is not only to be able to listen and comprehend, but also to read and understand what they're reading in all areas and all different types of texts. And they will learn about vocabulary and how to teach vocabulary. In each of those areas, they will also learn about how to assess those areas and how to use that assessment data to plan instruction, not only whole group, but individually and small group as well. We work very hard to do that. We also, again, we teach the students about teaching writing and how to help our youngest readers and writers write, how to help our older students structure their writing and how to organize their writing, and again, how to assess that and what to do with that assessment data once they have it.
Mr. Chairman, a follow-up. So does the Spiker 6 incorporate both elements then of more phonetic-based learning versus whole language? Or I still don't understand.
Yes. So it incorporates both. And we talk about both. I like to present both sides to my students because I think that, and the same reason that some of the materials that I shared with you today regarding dyslexia, it's important to be a critical consumer. It's important to know both sides of what's being presented. But we always come back to the research base. And what does the research base say? And that's what I always challenge them, whether you're looking at some aspects of a balanced literacy program, or you're looking at aspects of a very structured reading program. What does the research say? What is the research telling us? And what is important? And so we are grounded in absolutely in the research, saying, then there is no doubt what the research says about structured reading and phonics and explicit instruction. There's also no doubt that the research also says that we cannot disregard those other elements, and that we have to make sure that we are incorporating those as well.
Last question, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So can you give us a number of how many students you are seeing in the clinic each year? And then I'd love to understand a little bit about some of the work that you're doing when it comes to on-the-ground interventions, because I suspect you're working with kids who have some reading disabilities and struggles. I'd want to know what kind of interventions the clinic is offering. And I don't mind saying trying, because I think experimenting and figuring out what's right for a particular individual, that's to me an appropriate way of tackling the issue. But do you have numbers that show what kind of intervention helps kids? And I'm just trying to break out or understand some of the data that you might be collecting about how many kids you're helping and how which interventions you're using and which ones and what kind of improvement you're seeing in reading, whatever metric you use to measure that.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you again, Senator Ellis. I am new. I just started. I know in the past we've served a higher number of students in the tutoring center, and we did go virtual during the pandemic. We are now starting kind of back with that face-to-face tutoring, and we currently have 7 students that are being individually tutored in the clinic setting. So in the actual clinic setting, we work with kids, actually K through 12 this year, looking at really individually assessing them. This year, we are employing a new protocol called the Listening While Reading, Watching While Writing protocol that comes out of Nell Duke's work in Michigan. And it is an embedded assessment so that while a student, we only have a certain number of sessions with a student. And we were using so many of those sessions for assessment that we were not getting to the instruction that students needed. So we are piloting this assessment because it is an embedded assessment. So while a student is reading to a tutor, they can do the assessment and they can look for these key ideas based again off of those 6 areas. So they listen to a child read, they look at words that they might miss. What are they missing? What's happening? They look for patterns, they do those things. So that's what we will be using going forward. In the past, we've used assessments that are very similar to school assessments, like a DRA assessment or a DIBELS assessment. We've used those in the past. We have the advantage of being able to call the school and the teacher and get their assessment data, which allows us to hit the ground running as well. But we do structure the tutoring so that it is, one of the things that I love about how we structure tutoring is that the tutor is also followed by a literacy coach. And that literacy coach is someone who's very experienced in literacy instruction, that can observe, can offer feedback, can even go in the moment and support with tutoring. And that is also how we ran the Albany County summer school program this summer, where we had layers of tutors and literacy coaches that were helping in the moment observing. And I think that's a key ingredient, to have someone who has an expertise that can go in and intervene and offer debriefing. So we will continue with that model as well. And we'll be collecting data on this new protocol.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I think Senator Ellis gets kind of to the crux of it. It's this old war between the 2 styles and what serves best. So us old gray hairs thinks phonics is the right way, right? And so you're going to probably have a hard time changing my opinion of that. What I want to be sure, that's fine if you give a broad education, but in the end, are you teaching what they need to teach? And are they comfortable with what they're teaching? Because if you say it's all good, maybe it is all good, but you better have a specific way to figure that out. So do you teach a protocol like, we're going to try this, and then we're going to try this, and then we're going to try this, and then you see which one works with each different child, because children do learn differently, right? And so, how do you teach it? And then, we hear that there's an inherent bias against phonics, versus whole word in the academia world. And so is there an inherent bias? And if your tutors, if you're training teachers in this program you have, and the tutors are teaching one versus the other, so are they teaching both ways, right? Are your tutors teaching both ways so that the student teacher can see that? Or in fact, are they only teaching one way and so they only see one thing? And then back to my other question, you can just send me an email on it. I want to see how this literacy program has evolved at UW in timelines. And then it sounded like when in one of your replies to me that you haven't finished kind of incorporating everything. And so I want to understand what that is you haven't finished and what the exact timeline is on finishing that. So does that all make sense?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative Summers. I will absolutely get that information to you about our new program that is being phased in. So it's starting this fall with the new students coming in, and then we'll move forward. And I will absolutely send that to you. As there's no bias against phonics from my perspective. Research is very clear. Students need phonics instruction. They absolutely need phonics instruction. And my pre-service teachers in my course, and I can guarantee you in the other methods course, they hear that. And that is very much taught to them. They're taught how to teach it. They're taught how to assess it. The one difference that I might have with some of the other players in the reading war is that it cannot be to the exclusion of all of the other components. And I think one of the biggest proponents of the science of reading is Sonia Cabell out of Florida State. She is a strong supporter of that movement. And she will tell you that listening comprehension with kiddos that in the K-3 area is key. And if they're not being read to, and they're not discussing books, and they're not spending time in text, they're being put at a disadvantage. So absolutely, pre-service teachers at the University of Wyoming are learning how to teach phonics. It is a key component, but they are not learning how to teach phonics at the exclusion of everything else. They are also learning that those other components are extremely important and that they have to be used with the phonics instruction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, Dr. Spiker, welcome back to Wyoming. My question is about, and it goes to our previous discussion with the WDE, that we have not only IEPs, which of course all of you are very familiar with, but IRPs. And I'm curious about your training of these elementary educators in terms of recognizing not what would become a kid that would get special ed services, but a child who needs kind of reading intervention at that earliest level. So not just the training, whether it be phonics or whole language or the combination, but that percentage of kids that are not doing well enough and intervening immediately. Are you training students to identify those youngest kiddos who need help?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative Conley. We are, in keeping in mind that we are training novice teachers. And we also need to think that there's an entire system when they do go out to teach, that they will be supported in that as well. It takes experience, it takes mentoring, it takes support. So yes, we are working with them to do that. And we are also working with schools to help support them as they continue to grow as an educator.
Just a follow-up comment. That to me seems to be a critical piece, because in all honesty, we are relying on those K-3 teachers to be the ones who signal to a principal, for example, or even a special ed teacher that, hey, I've got these 5 kids in my kindergarten or first grade class that are not responding well enough. We are relying on them, so therefore we're relying on you to train them to identify those kids. And again, that curiosity, do you feel like your new curriculum is doing that well enough? Because we're relying on you to do that.
I absolutely, Mr. Chair. Representative Conley, I absolutely do think with the addition of a diagnostic and reading difficulties course, that will be even more clearly addressed as to how to see these indications of struggle, especially as early kindergarten, and then what steps to take. I absolutely do feel we are on the right path with that. And I think currently we are also doing that within our methods courses and within student teaching.
One follow-up, assessing. How are you going to assess the success, for example, of that new program?
We will continue to do the measures that we use currently, looking at the praxis scores for literacy that the students take and the portfolio assessment that they do. We also have our own assessments, our common assessments that we use at the university. That course will have an assessment attached to it, and we will collect data on that course as well, along with those qualitative things where we get student feedback as to the course.
Well, I'll take a privilege of the chair as a personal issue. My granddaughter is currently enrolled in this class, and of course, it's just getting started good right now, and so, but we get a lot of feedback from her already about the class and the kinds of things she's learning, and she has the biggest critic in the world is her mother, who is a kindergarten teacher, and so I sit at the Sunday table and listen to the conversation between them. And my granddaughter is very, very pleased with the kind of program that's going on right now. And I think it's really going to do a great job of preparing her to be a good primary teacher when she gets out. And I'm not saying that just to get her a better grade, but.
Thank you. There you see one of the strengths of the Wyoming legislature. It's a small state, and we hear things, we know things.
Absolutely.
It's a real advantage. So I think you should take that as a major cut.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Chair. I do.
Let me ask two things that I'm unclear. One is are all the students that are in the primary, learning to be primary grade teachers, they all going through this program? I wasn't clear whether this was just a research offshoot or this was the whole, everybody was taking this.
Everyone goes through this, yes.
Okay, good. Second question I have for you is a little more speculative. You're teaching how to do assessments. And one of the things I've wondered about with our whole program here, I've heard complaints from some of the teachers that we're using very formal assessment techniques to find out who's reading and who isn't. Do we really need, and they're saying to me that some of those are just not very age appropriate for these kind of students. Do we really need these formal assessments that we're requiring? Or should we really be relying mostly on the judgment of the teachers? My instinct is the teacher knows when she's got a student that's struggling, even if she may not have adequate time to fully deal with it. What's your thought on the formal assessments that we're starting to require here in statutes?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I use a word that is kind of dangerous in literacy. I believe there needs to be a balance. I believe that we all need accountability. We all want to measure things. And so a formal assessment, a diagnostic assessment, a screener, all of those things are important. But you're talking to a Wyoming teacher who was a Wyoming teacher for many, many years before I moved over to the university. And I will tell you, we have got to empower our teachers. We have to train them well, and we are striving hard to do that. Then we have to trust them with great leadership to do their jobs and to know what they're doing. And so I really do think that, yes, as a seasoned teacher, I can work with a reader and I don't have to give them a formal assessment, and I can find out some things about them. But I also see the need and the desire for having some formal measurements as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Along those lines, I'm really encouraged to hear kind of the direction the College of Education's heading toward. I think my concern, though, is a little backward looking about teachers that might need some professional development now. But I would be curious to get your opinion on how much robust interventions do we need for professional development in this area in particular to give teachers other tools?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator Ellis. We are striving to do that for schools, to provide any gaps that there are for those K-3 teachers. I do think that there are teachers that definitely would welcome that support. Research is always growing and changing. We know so much more than even, way back when I started. We know more than we did 2 years ago. And to be able to keep teachers current on what is best practice, what research is saying, here's some things to try with kids that are research-based. I think that's key, and I think that teachers would welcome that.
And follow up, Mr. Chairman. We're, clearly very focused on K-3, but then we're neglecting kids that maybe have slipped through the cracks and are in high school or junior high that are still struggling. Can you tell us a little bit more about how we really get after those? What kind of professional development can we be offering to junior high, high school teachers? And I'm just kind of curious to know what your thoughts are, what's out there. I mean, is this a really important need in Wyoming or not so much of an important need?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have been contacted more at the clinic since I started by middle school teachers than anyone else since in the past couple of months that I've been there. I think that middle school teachers are starting to struggle with what happens if a kid does get to middle school and they are a struggling reader. How do I help them when I'm also trying to teach math, when I'm trying to teach science? And so that is an area that we are definitely looking at. How do we support these teachers to support a struggling reader at that level? What tools are there available? What can we do to help with from the word level all the way to comprehension? That's something that we definitely are focusing on with our work in the clinic.
Chairman Scott, I think they're calling attention to me. Professors Hall and Brock, thank you very much. To say I'm new here. Professors Hall and Brock have been in the field quite extensively. And I just want to make sure that if there's something from their experience, and I know Professor Hall that you have been working directly on some of this professional learning opportunity, if it's appropriate, maybe they could weigh in here.
Yes, so I've worked a lot with middle and high school teachers in the state and around the country in general. And a lot of middle and high school teachers, I would say in Wyoming, could definitely use professional development as it relates to reading instruction, just in general, because they're really knowledgeable about their discipline. But they don't necessarily, they're not going to be as up to speed as elementary teachers are, who are getting a heavy amount of literacy instruction. So looking at professional development opportunities for them, I think is really, really critical.
Albert wanted.
And then I'm going to give Professor Rock a opportunity, and then we're going to take a brief break and come back to your presentation.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. What I want to know, is there a structured professional development program? And do you work with multiple school districts, or is it, oh, I got a teacher that called me up because you have this literacy center? So how much structure is there to your professional development program, and how many districts do you reach?
Mr. Chair, thank you, Representative Summers. We have a structure. We begin working with a district when they do call and they have a need or they have a desire for professional development. We go to the school and we conduct a needs assessment. We have a document that we've designed. When we're working with K-3 schools, we are now using the WDE guidance document that is new, that has all of the elements for Wyoming in there. We utilize that as part of our needs assessment. We go in and we pre-survey teachers to ask them what they're currently doing in their literacy practices. We talk to the administrators. Then when we visit the school, we observe, we look for those key areas. We meet with the teachers in small groups. We have conversations and interviews with them. We meet with the administrator. And then we take all of that information and we compile it into what we see as strengths, what we see as needs. Then we go back to that district and meet with the faculty and discuss that report. Because we do realize we're seeing a snapshot and they live in that moment, in that context. So we have a discussion, and through that discussion, we identify their needs and what they agree upon as needs. So for instance, if a district says, we really need to build background knowledge and we really want to work with vocabulary with our students, then we agree upon that and we go back and we set a plan for them to move forward to work on that focus area or one or two focus areas. And we compile research that we can share with them. We may do a book study to start things off so that we have a common language and we have some consistent discussion. And then we go in and we offer on-site professional development. We offer virtual consultations in between those on-site professional developments. And we utilize not only the faculty sitting here at the table, but affiliate faculty at the university to do so.
And my second question there, Mr. Chairman, was how many districts are taking advantage of that?
Currently, we are working with 2 schools in Fremont County, and we are working with Bighorn County. Both Burlington and Cowley will be doing a needs assessment there. And we are working with Albany County School District in their middle school.
Just as a quick overview, we've worked with other districts across time, and I'll just give you a couple of concrete examples. Sublette County 9, Jeff McKelkey at Big Piney High School asked us to come and work with him. We engaged in the entire process that Dr. Spiker mentioned. Our work with schools is long-term. So we worked with that school for, I believe, up to 3 years. And the issue is, in order to develop the kind of deep conceptual knowledge that teachers need to do the kind of work that they want to be able to do, it takes time. And it takes us, I think somebody talked earlier about collaborating. So we collaboratively work with the schools and with the districts to develop a plan and then implement that plan. Another concrete example is Evansville Elementary, right outside of Casper here, Title I school. We worked extensively with them for 3 years, and they decided, what is it that we need to focus on? They look at their scores, they look at how things are working, and then we collaboratively work with them over an extensive period of time to develop background knowledge to improve teaching and then improve student learning.
With that, maybe we can
I'm gratified to see the state superintendent has joined us. I offered her the opportunity to say a few words, but I think she would prefer not to and wants to listen. So we will welcome her and proceed with the University of Wyoming.
Thank you. If we could go to the slides. I've reached the point where my students are always very excited because I don't think we have very many slides left. So the only other thing that we were going to talk about today, and we were asked to talk about today, is some perspectives on, as we've mentioned, the reading wars that are going on and dyslexia and English language acquisition. One of the problems with the methods for identifying dyslexia is that the definitions vary so widely that it makes it very difficult to define what dyslexia actually is and a definitive diagnosis. And that is one of the reasons that I shared some of the resources that I did with you. So because of that variation in definition, we can get numbers anywhere from 3% of the population of our students, 20% of the population. It really depends on who's defining it and how it's defined and how it is identified. There is, looking at, again, I've talked about the structured reading and how that can be very successful for dyslexic students. But the research base also, as I've mentioned already today, shows that there are another number of other factors as well. So you can't look at one to the exclusion of everything else. So ultimately serving all of the students is our goal. And so in our programming, in our work with pre-service teachers, we do incorporate that wide range of methods. And next slide. I think that's it.
Right there.
Mhm.
We had testimony at the last meeting that the people are starting to see a difference in the brain areas that are active. Dyslexic students, it's different from non-dyslexic students. Which areas of the brain are active, and that strikes me that we're leading toward the ability to get a medical diagnosis of dyslexia. Will that, if we actually get there and that becomes widespread, will that make a difference in how you deal with a dyslexic student if you have a firm medical diagnosis?
Thank you, Chair. Potentially, where we may be headed that way. One of the concerns with fMRIs and their use in diagnosing dyslexia is that currently they are done in a medical situation. They are done under different circumstances than a classroom context, where there are other factors involved in a classroom context. It's a medical diagnosis and not necessarily an educational diagnosis. So as research develops, and certainly if the medical community says this is a medical diagnosis, then absolutely, I believe things will adapt and change as they do. As of right now, if you get on the Mayo Clinic website and you Google dyslexia or you search dyslexia on their site, they have a definition that says it's just a confluence of symptoms of poor reading. And their recommendations are the 5 big ideas. They recommend working with phonemic awareness. They recommend structured phonics instruction. They recommend fluency, comprehension, vocabulary. So yes, if the medical field gets on board and that research goes that direction to where a student could actually be diagnosed with a medical condition that is called dyslexia, then absolutely, I believe the educational community would respond.
Not anywhere near there yet.
No. All right, I believe we are out of slides, so we welcome any other further questions or discussion.
So, Mr. Chairman, I have a question for the dean. So how do we attract good students to the prep program, to the teacher preparation program? So how do we get good students that will ultimately become good teachers? And then how do we keep good teachers? And what's your role in that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, $1 million question. It's increasingly difficult to attract well-prepared, and preparation, the ability to prepare varies by district. And we want to come back to that perhaps if time permits. And students who have the dispositions and orientations to be a great teacher. Other occupations far outweigh the wage structure of educators. The prestige associated with education has declined over time. Our colleagues and friends in Finland, as an example, I think of maybe the polar case, opposite case here. You ask high school students and middle school students in Finland what occupation it is that they find most prestigious, and they will cite most often teaching. That is not the case in the United States, and trying to get talented young people to choose teaching as a career is increasingly difficult. It's not well rewarded, it's not well distinguished, and it doesn't carry a lot of prestige associated with it, just by function of the way that we have evolved our thinking about the role of education in our society, and frankly, the way we funded it. But that said, the inputs are one of the most essential pieces of our success in education. And so at the University of Wyoming, we have, through our Trustees Education Initiative, one of our first steps is cultivating a group of young people who will be predisposed to choose education as a major when they get to college, or as a major when they enter the community college and think about the transfer. Those efforts need to be redoubled. We will be working with a group called Brilliant Pathways that is expert on college going for students that are attending rural schools. And we will be working with that group to tailor their programs to education specifically, so that we can get the best and brightest in Wyoming thinking actively about a meaningful career in education. And despite what I say about the prestige and the pay, education is still a pretty darn good career. It's one of the few real true careers left to young people today. And it's just, it requires us to have an ability to begin to help socialize and cultivate that view. Now, keeping these young people in the field, keeping our novice teachers in the field is the back end of it. If we're very successful in our programs, if we were to carry the students to the door and wish them well, things probably won't go so well. They need our continued and active support in the early parts of their careers, and they need our continued and active involvement in bringing them back for further education and further professional learning along the way, to allow them to develop the skills and expertise that will be personally rewarding to them, and will allow them to share that with the people in their communities and in their schools. So we know through the research that those are the elements that define the ability to attract the best prepared, best oriented students to education and to keep them in the field.
Mr. Chairman, so I appreciate that, but you really didn't tell me what you're going to actually do to try to get good students into these programs. And then on the professional development side, I think that is something from Finland, is not so much what you were talking about, but the fact that whoever teaches those kids, they follow them into the classroom and follow them through their career, at least for a few years. And so what are you, and I've heard for years that that's kind of the gold standard around the world. Are you doing that? Are you following your kids into their new classrooms for a period? Their first 3 years makes or breaks them, right? They're either going to get hired, they're not going to get hired, they're going to succeed or fail. And so what are you doing to do that? So one, kind of back to the original question, what are you doing explicitly to try to get good students into your program? Because this was supposed to be, we heard from past dean, we're going to create the best of the best prep program in the country. And so how do we get those good students? I want to hear details on how you get good students. And then I want to hear, how are you following those new teachers into the classroom? Or how do you intend to do that into the future?
Right, to the recruitment part of it and the orientation part of it, it's the place that we're probably the weakest, and we need more work there. And I will write to you and offer you detail on what we are doing and what I feel is working and what is not working, and some proposed directions. And I'll draw your attention to best practices across the country. And I'll do that in a page, so you don't have to read 20 a 20-page document. I could write about that if you'd like. To your latter point, we are very squarely now an outcomes-based program, not a process-based program about are you doing it like everybody else is doing it? No, we're an outcomes-based program. And yes, we do follow our graduates into the field. And we're in a coalition with 20 other schools of education around the country that have developed outcomes assessments that we're assessing our candidates, call our teachers who are going through our programs. We're assessing our candidates as they're in the program, asking them about what their perceptions and experiences and expectations are. And we're assessing them when they're in the field and asking how their actual experience in the field and their encounters in the field relate to what they got in the program and are relating to what their expectations about their career are going to be. And we're using that information then to refine what we're doing in our program on a real-time basis to help ensure that the next group will have a condition that's a little bit better than the previous group. So we are very actively engaged in that outcome-based assessment, and I'd be happy to share some of that instrumentation with you. And it's some of our findings. We're about 2 years into that work, and I have been very aggressively expanding that work to involve other institutions so that we have comparators that we're working with on that longitudinal basis, not waiting for a cohort to tell us how things went and then making adjustments and waiting for the next cohort. We can do this in real time with a larger set of partners, and I've been very aggressive on that front.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Thomas, just as a follow-up, then our next item on the agenda is a draft bill. And that draft bill has an obligation for professional development for kind of for teachers of young grades, very specifically about kind of reading and learning outcomes. And I'm curious if the university is able to provide that professional development, and if so, how much it will cost.
Yeah, well, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Representative Conley, yes, the university would be willing to engage in a partnership around the provision of that professional development, professional learning. Absolutely. How much it would cost? We would need to talk about what's being proposed. This requires partnerships with PTSB, requires partnerships with the Department of Education, requires partnerships with our districts. We're willing, we need to make those partnerships to allow something like this to work. Let me state unequivocally though, yes, we are very, very interested in being a primary provider of that professional development.
Let me warn you one thing. Before we get to that draft legislation, I am going to call for any general public comment. And then we will look at that legislation, go through it. And I'm going to ask the committee not to take final action on it today, because I think we will, by November, we'll have knowledge where we'll be able to improve it significantly. But it is a start, and we ought to take a look at it today. So we'll do that. But we're going to go to general public comment first, and then come to that. So be warned. Now, who else?
Brown, and I would like to.
Okay, Senator Brown, and then Representative Nutt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is really a question for you as the dean, I guess. Ultimately, the presentation that you guys have provided us today shows us what you guys are doing now. It's a completely different story than what I saw 5 years ago and what was being conducted 5 years ago in the College of Education. So that being said, my question to you directly, is this a culture change within your college that's going to take years and years to revamp? Or is this something that you expect to have immediate results and immediate changes taking place? So our students who are learning in these K-3 areas right now will see these changes with these new teachers rolling out.
Mr. Chairman. Representative Brown, thank you very much for that great observation. I've been here for 8 weeks, so I can't take credit for the culture change that's occurred over the last 5 years as much as I would like to, because that's the hardest part of our work, is I think is at the root of your question. You have observed a deliberate investment in this College of Education. The trustees have played a big role in that through the Trustees Education Initiative. Our faculty have played a huge role in that and adopting some of the innovations that were promoted through the resourcing through the Trustees Education Initiative. You are, I think, if you can observe the change over 5 years, you've seen probably 80% of the culture change that's necessary for a more sensitive college of education in terms of change and response. So no, things will not be immediate. Very few things are immediate in the world that we work in. But I do believe that we on an annual basis will be able to report our understandings, our changes in the expectations about what we expect from that and be able to measure that the following year as well. I am very data oriented. As I said earlier, we are an outcomes-based college now. I intend to hold that very firmly as we go forward and be able to speak through evidence. And so I look forward to talking with you next year and hearing that question. But please give me 12 months.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dean Thomas, our good chairman gave us a class assignment when we were in Saratoga. And that was to go home and talk to our educators and find out, get some feedback from them about boots on the ground and what they're really facing. And so I did. I made every effort to try to get a hold of multiple folks that are from, well, I'll put it this way. I talked to your customers and curriculum directors, superintendents, quite clear across the state, not just exclusively in my northeast corner. And I guess my thought is, and I'm just going to pass on some information to you that was relayed to me and some questions that they had in an effort to I'm learning you guys are just got a hold of the rudder. So you're getting ready to be able to maybe navigate this ship in a better direction, because what was relayed to me is that they would prefer, and it was across the board, almost across the board, all but one person said that they would prefer a graduate from either Chadron or BH to a UW graduate for primary education. And some of the reasons that they gave for that were the teachers that are coming lack classroom management skills. And another one was teaching strategies. And they said that a lot of those issues that they're having to deal with could be corrected if the University of Wyoming would take on what Arizona State University, and that was specifically given to me, is that we require 1 year of team teaching before certification. And they said a lot of the issues that they face are teachers that are just not ready to meet. And we talked a little bit about class size, 30 kids, and how do you deal with that? And what was relayed to me was the fact that there are evidently, and you can help me understand this, student placement from the University of Wyoming goes to a kind of a reserved number of schools. And one person said that, you have to pay $6,000 in order to get into the UW program to have your school be considered for sending teachers to them. And so my question then would be to you folks, if you've got districts across the state of Wyoming that are doing an exemplary job of early education, early elementary education and reading readiness, would it not make sense to take the top 10% of these schools and encourage your students or give opportunity for them to go up and team teach with these people that are obviously doing the job and getting it done? Another thing that they said is that VH and Chadron don't have that. Said we can get teachers in there. And they said the thing that they liked about that is because, for lack of a better description, we get to test drive them. They said, and then we pursue these young people because we want them in our program because they fit our communities. And another thing that was relayed to me was a lot of times teachers that come out of the University of Wyoming struggle to relate to the more rural communities, which Wyoming has a lot of. And so they said that if there was a way that the university would be more willing or more accepting or less charging for the opportunity to be able to have students placed in their districts, they believe that it would give them more opportunity to be able to get new teachers into those rural communities, help them to understand some of the nuances that go with that, and help them to be more effective when they team teach them with decades of experience from teachers that have proven they can get the job done. So it's not trying to give anybody a hard time. It's just saying that evidently there's an issue out there that has been, and I trust that you guys are going to address that issue, that University of Wyoming students will be the preferred teachers that would come in there because they've got the ability and they've got the talent. What are your thoughts on a full year of team teaching in an effort for accreditation, because it was also brought to my attention. They said by doing that, you're going to put these students at a disadvantage financially. But I also talked to a gal that had 7 years of the University of Wyoming with her degree. And she says that was what you had to do. She said, I paid for a babysitter and I got my experience, but my experience was what made it work. And so she said that that was the biggest part, the most gratifying and the most useful part of her education was the time that she spent with a certified teacher that had experience that made her able to walk into that classroom and to be effective from the get-go. Not saying there's not professional development that needs to continue on. All of us need that. Even in ranching, I think it's a good idea to have continued professional development. But those nuances to that, I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, are those issues that you see, and is that a problem with having a very limited number of places you can place student teachers to get them the experience they need? And would you like to see, or would you be willing to look at broadening those opportunities for other smaller districts to have opportunity to get the benefit of your new teachers?
Chair Scott. Representative Nyman, thank you. It won't happen again. Representative Nyman. I won't do that. I won't do that. There's very little that's more important than field experience in our work. We have the architecture of our programs. We've been talking a lot about that today, about how we structure our programs, what's expected in those programs. But the articulation of those programs with the apprenticeship phase and the field experience is what makes an outstanding teacher and what makes for an outstanding program. There is nothing more important from my view and from the view of research. It pains me to receive the report that you just gave, and it was a thoughtful report with some details that were very, very helpful. We're here presenting, but frankly, an important part of being an expert is listening. And I intend to get to the bottom of a lot of what I've heard that sounds like what you just reported from others. I think at the root of that is what you're circling around, and that is the way that we are, the way we're structuring the field experiences, our teaching experiences and our practica, and the amount of time that's spent on those. And then the third piece would be how those are cohering to the academic program back in Laramie at the university or wherever that would be taught. So let me come directly at what I would hope to see going forward. I think this is the biggest lever that we have available to us. And we're talking about early grades here this morning, but this is across the board. I believe that we need to be present in every county and every school district in Wyoming. I believe that we need to create the mechanisms to do that. It is difficult. There is a lot of space in Wyoming. It requires resourcing candidates in ways that allow them to move to Sheridan to do their teaching experience while still also having a life in Laramie. So there are ways around this. I mean, I'm just talking a couple of logistics here. There are also the receiving end, the communities that we would be sending our students to. Let me turn it on another dimension though. One of the most important things in producing a great teacher is ensuring that those field experiences are cohering with the academic program and ensuring that all of that is speaking to what the aspirations of that candidate are. If a candidate's aspiring to go back to his or her community, and his or her community is a rural community, we better have a pool of rural communities that we can pull from that look a lot like what that person is thinking about for their future. Because matching those settings with the student's aspirations is one of the keys to retaining teachers when they get in the field. The other part of it is a grade level. So a student wants to go back to their rural community and Sunrise, and they want to teach elementary school, but all we have is something for them in Albany County in middle school, and they're really interested in social studies, but all we've really got is language. That's not helping our cause, and we've got to fix that. And again, it's not easy. It's expensive. It's logistically challenging, but I believe that there is little more that will advance our interest in preparing the nation's best educators than solving that problem. And I believe we can do that in Wyoming because of the unified nature of the bodies that are in control of all of this. So I hope that I have been crystal clear on that. I greatly appreciate the question. And I hope I will get a question from Representative Brown next year I'll get a question from you about how this is working out because we're on this already.
Up here. I appreciate that, Dean. I do. And I'm sure the people that I represent and the folks up there that I've chatted and had these conversations with will be very encouraged to hear that. Now, I will say, I'll just finish with this. One of the folks I visited with made a statement and it just made a lot of sense to me. And so I'll just relay that to you in the way he said it. He said, the right person in front of a classroom is more important than the curriculum. And so that's why I think we get into this, what we're talking about here. I mean, we can talk about data, we can talk about a lot of these different things, but being able to get people, and that was a point that was made to me by another person in a hiring position. He said, I've actually had an opportunity from BH to have a kid that came and he said, we encouraged him not to teach. You know, he said, don't dislike you. He said, you're a great person and very intelligent. He said, but we could see that it would be less than ideal to have him trying to teach young children. And he relayed to me, the only way we'd have known that is by having an extended amount of time to have that relationship, to be able to help them and to be able to save a classroom full of kids. So in all of this that was relayed to me is just that opportunity to be able to have that training with experienced teachers to encourage and to sow into the lives of these young people to help them be better. Everything that we're discussing here today is critical. So I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Can you talk a little more about your student teacher program that goes out into the districts and whether, it's my understanding they've got to pay a fee to do all of this, or how does that work? So they've got to be a membership, you have to have membership in something, and so there's a fee and the fee's based upon the district. Can you explain how that works and why we're charging districts to put kids out in districts?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, I'll report back to you on that in detail. I need to get to the bottom of that myself. I don't have enough information to offer you anything that would resolve our questions around this. I share some of your questions.
Okay, thank you.
I would comment on this particular topic that it makes a lot of sense to me. I've spent since 1993 was chair of the health committee, and that's a standard feature of medical education. And it's been well worked out there. It makes a lot of sense to me, and it makes a lot of sense to me in this context. And it's not something I would think we would want to legislate on the immediate future, but conceivably, we could do so in several different ways. We could modify our block grant funding to provide the funding necessary for the teachers to student teachers to come out and student teach for a period and do it through the school districts that way. We could conceivably, for at least some class of teachers, make it a requirement of certification. There's a number of ways we could approach that one legislatively, but my recommendation to the committee is we don't try that until the school and the school of education and school districts have worked most of the kinks out and have a consensus as to what they need to really make the thing work. Because it does strike me that there's a number of considerations. Maybe specifically paying them a certain set amount to do that would be important. There's several things we could think about, but we'll have to get your act together before it's appropriate for us to act. So I would comment on that. Senator Elphis, did you have something to add?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I was just going to ask if we can get some more information, maybe from the school districts about concerns regarding placement and obviously more details about where we're being placed and what the policies are. It does seem intuitive that it's going to be easier to have confidence in hiring a specific teacher if they were performing in that school district and if they were able to engage with that school district, both from the perspective of that incoming teacher as well as from the district getting to know that individual. It's going to give you some confidence. I have not heard the same concerns as Representative Nyman regarding placement preference for Black Hills over the university. But I think part of that, you just kind of look at the geography. Black Hills is what, 30 miles probably from Sundance. I suspect it's a pretty good representative spot for somebody to be able to commute and understand the circumstances there. And there's probably a strong relationship there. It's much further to get from Sundance down to Laramie at the university. Whereas students, obviously, if they're doing their placement in Laramie, and the university is going to be easy. So I think there's a lot to that concept. And I think the more that we can get diversity of locations in the state, the better we're going to be in serving the statewide needs, serving the needs expressed by Representative Nyman and others. So I share those questions, but the additional question I would like to know is perhaps asking out to the school districts to get a broader sense of concerns and where they draw upon. Maybe some of our Western districts end up with Utah students that only have to come a short distance, but it would be good to know more about whether it's the localization versus the education that ends up playing a factor in any additional insight that you can provide when you report back next time on that, I think would be helpful. I don't know exactly how to assess that out, but thank you, Mr. Chairman.
When add to that, yes, you would hear what Representative Nyman heard in his part of the work. But I'll tell you, I have heard that right here in Casper. That's not current information, but I've heard a lot of. I see in the back row, the School Boards Association lobbyists, and I would ask you to take back to your school boards and your school administrators that this committee is interested in this topic.
That's 3 strikes.
Yeah. That we are interested in this particular topic and are looking for feedback from the districts as to what they see as needed and useful to them. So I think this is going to be a matter of ongoing discussion within the committee. And School of Education, you get the last word on this one.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. This has been enlightening. It's been a great opportunity to spend time with my new colleagues. Thank you for sharing your observations and your input so candidly and for the very good questions. There's one piece that's missing from the conversation, and we can talk about the field experiences and the importance of those. And you've heard my position on that there is very little more important. The field experiences are catalyzed by a great team of mentor teachers and master teachers. And we do not have, in my initial judgment, an adequate core of outstanding mentor teachers that will serve to oversee these placements in whatever area we make arrangements for those to happen. Establishing a Wyoming mentor teacher core, I'm just branding it that way right now, should be a top priority for us collectively to ensure that our candidates have the supervision and the guidance of the state's best teachers wherever they may be across Wyoming. Again, a tall order, but there are ways that I think we can distinguish our greatest teachers, and we can provide them with the professional learning that they might benefit from at that point in their career, while carrying along the next generation of novice teachers to success in districts across the state. So I think to make these field experiences work, we've really got to have those mentor and master teachers. Senator Scott, you asked earlier, and it was a rhetorical question, and I won't give a long exegesis on what I hope to do. You've heard pieces of what I see us doing in the College of Education at the University of Wyoming to help move forward a system of education that will be second to none nationally. That includes recruitment, finding out how we create a pipeline of young people and people who may be interested in returning, changing careers mid-career, coming into the field of education. It includes the architecture of our programs, and Dr. Spiker and my other colleagues talked a bit about what we're doing in some of our programs at the university, but we need to get that right. That's always a work in progress. It's continuous learning, and it will always be evolving. Third thing will be these field experiences and the pairing of our candidates with mentor teachers and in a diverse array of settings around the state that's representative of what they'll encounter in the state that will lead them to want to stay in those settings as they go out. And then finally, following our candidates into the field and not thinking about graduating new teachers and is what we do at the University of Wyoming, but think about how we graduate master teachers at the University of Wyoming. And this is a lifelong, career-long commitment that exists between the university, the college, and our candidates who go into the field. It also requires firm partnerships with our colleagues at the WDE, our colleagues on the school board, PTSB, the School Boards Association locally, and a host of other people, as well as you. So we can have the best educator preparation program and the best leadership program in the country at the University of Wyoming. But it will only carry us so far if we don't have a system that is coherent and supportive of each other's roles in achieving an education system that's second to none in the US. Chair Scott, Chair Paxton, thank you very, very much for your time and your indulgence. It's been an honor to have some time with you this morning. That was all I got.
One straight suggestion, just about. I've seen in the medical field, sometimes they will make a doctor that's mentoring the doctors out in the field, make him adjunct faculty of some kind. And a formal designation like that, coupled perhaps with some special training, some events at the university or around the state to one, teach them what you're looking for and keep them up to date on new developments. I just throw that out as a suggestion, one way to structure it and get some extra prestige to the teachers involved and some extra professional benefits. So that's just a stray suggestion. You can do with it as you choose.
Chairman Scott, it's a very sound suggestion.
And then I had one further question I really wanted to ask. We've been talking about this problem all day. And at the last meeting, we're trying to figure out how many of the kids really are falling into this group that are not learning how to read adequately, and aren't reading adequately by the end of third grade. And I heard everything from, well, it's the 21% that the Y-top shows is below basic on that assessment, to it's 50%, which was, I think, or just under 50%, which was the Y-top of the students that are basic and below basic on that assessment. I don't think I believe either of the extremes, but I'm interested in, can we quantify approximately, I've been saying as guess that it's around a quarter. Can we quantify approximately how many students, what percentage of the students we are talking about here?
Chairman Scott, likely we could. I don't have that data to look at. I suppose we could get there. I had a very brilliant assessment professor once who taught me about triangulation and the importance of looking at more than one piece of data. So if we could couple different types of data and look at that across the board, then I suppose we could probably get close to really understanding what that number might be.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if you allow me just a couple of minutes, I know we've blown our schedule completely out of the water, but just a couple of things. we talked earlier about attracting the best and brightest into education. And so we have to be a little bit careful about making it more difficult to get a degree in education than it is in other professions. And so, is it a hardship on the kids to have a full year of education? And is that a 5-year program in other schools? What do they do there, And so I think we got to be careful about that kind of thing, just a little bit anyway, to be considerate of that. And back in the dark ages, when I was still teaching, University of Wyoming used to offer credit waivers for people who took in student teachers. I don't know if they still do that. I don't think they do, but I think I had 13 or 14 student teachers over the years, and those credits helped me get my master's degree. So just something to think about.
Microphone's going to be the death of me.
Is that strike 3?
No, it's about 10. Committee, what I want to do right now is we did ask at the last meeting for committee members to go out and talk to some of their local educators, teachers, and other educators, administrators locally. I know the timing on that was very bad because middle of the summer and they're not as available, but I did want to have brief time for reporting on how we've done so far on that, because I think that having the committee members talk to people with actual experience in the field who are trying to live with the problems we're talking about is real important. And Representative Nyman gave us a partial report on one aspect of what he learned. And so I'm going to call on him next to anything else on that he elaborated, that he learned that he wants to elaborate on. Then I'm going to ask if anybody else wants to report on that at this point. And if not, I may say a word too. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, some of the other points that when I discussed this with these educators, as far as the state is concerned, and I was going to ask Ms. Hamill when she was giving her testimony, but she had plenty of other stuff going on at that time. So one thing that they did bring up to me that was a concern was a lack of consistent testing across the state. They said they relayed to me, they do the YTOP, we do the MAP, we do the IXL. The testimony was given to me was that we need consistent statewide testing to be able to get a consistent line so that we know exactly what we're doing. And it would also was relayed to me that how, and they understood that you've got a lot of local dynamics, that you want local control. But the struggle that was relayed to me in many instances is that kids coming from different districts are very different in how they test and how and where they're at and the levels that is acceptable here. Then you come to here and they say, well, it's not acceptable there. We've got to get you going and get you up, and puts a lot of them at a disadvantage. And so what I got from that was and the question I'd like to ask, I guess, is what can be done? And if so, how would a person go about doing a kind of more of a standardized test so we can get a line that would, if people move or whatever, not saying from out of state, but locally, to get a good idea of whether or not we're getting the job done and how we judge that and how would we implement that was one point that they brought up to me. One other point that they brought up was a swinging pendulum and as far as some of the curriculums and stuff like that that are offered. Said it's very hard to be able to get on something that really works when the state's saying, well, we'd like you to do this now. And the question was posed to me is, could we get more interaction with the districts to be able to come and work with districts where we can see that they're obviously doing a good job because they're testing and they're doing well consistently. Now, granted, there's going to be moves up and down, kids come, kids go, things change. But being able to glean information and provide some accountability and some level line saying, here, this is working. They're having obvious good results here. And the Department of Education's willingness to say, look at those folks and say, how can we take what they're learning and not have to try to reinvent the wheel and move that on to and offer those as opportunities for other districts to be able to get a good, solid, stable, uniform more across the statewide opportunity to see that education process. One thing that they relayed to me, and it was discussed on multiple points here today, is the 5 points. And that is more so than whole word or whole language learning. While they said 30% of the kids do really well with whole language. They said they just learn that way. That's fine. But consider, and I'm very encouraged to hear what the university has to say, and even the testimony from you folks here at the Wyoming Department of Education, that we need to not let the pendulum swing away from phonics and from those 5 points those kids need. It was relayed to me that, and in discussion, that some of this dyslexia discussion is tied to that. It's based on the fact on how the human brain works, how it breaks down and decodes. When we were teaching more of a phonics-based level on education, early education, a lot of kids that struggled with dyslexia or what they're determining as dyslexia were never realized because their brains were learning it in a way that they could learn it. We didn't know they had it. But when we changed the system that we used to be able to teach, we saw an increase in it. So a lot of kids were being taught would never have known they had the issue. And that by the phonetic, well, they gave you the list of it here. Comprehensive fluency, phonetic, thank you. Awareness and vocabulary, all were things that the way the human brain works compensated for those issues. And so that was an encouragement that came to me to relay to you, emphasis on phonics and phonetic awareness and helping these people that many times we can maybe avoid the issues later on by encouraging that at a very early stage for kids. Not saying that every kid's going to learn that way. No, there's not one size fits all. But as we watch things develop and data start to increase and show, it worked. And I guess the question that was posed to me by one educator says, why do you quit a winning horse? You never say whoa in a horse race, And so that was one of their thoughts on that. Oh man. I didn't have as hard a time finding educators that wanted to talk. I mean, I could call a wrong number and talk to educators that wanted to talk at my country. Trying to think, and I'll stop there, but if there's other legislators who'd like to share what they learned. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Newsom.
Thank you. I had an opportunity to talk with Jay Curtis and his leadership staff in the elementary schools, the three principals of the elementary schools in Powell. Yesterday morning at 11:40, you got an email from Jay and a group of educators outlining what they thought about as we go forward the bill. So I won't reiterate any of that, but what I will reiterate is that they work very hard to identify those children, not when they're 2 standard deviations from norm, but when they first start to have trouble. And that's their goal. The other thing that they commented on extensively was the importance of the instructional facilitators. And as we talked, as Mr. Thomas talked about the establishing a mentor teacher corps, we already have that. We fund those positions as far as instructional facilitators. But then in talking to other districts, they sometimes fill those instructional facilitator positions with people that are not qualified to do that. Anecdotally, I heard of a young woman being hired as a coach in a district, and they didn't have a teaching position for her, so they made her an instructional facilitator. She had no idea what that meant. She knew what the paycheck was, but she didn't have any idea what skill set that required, and it was inappropriate to hire her for that position. So I think that we need to be more clear on identifying what skill set we want for instructional facilitators. If they have a number of years of teaching, some professional development in that piece of it. And so I think that as we look at, especially those high performing districts, and I asked about if they conform to the model, and they said they did. And so as I looked early on, as I was assigned to this committee, we got that notebooks and notebooks of information. And I did just kind of a simple correlation of districts that were conforming to the model and their test scores. And what I found in that just simple looking at stuff in my brain was that those districts that are conforming to the model are the higher performing districts. So that's.
Mr. Chairman, briefly, I'm lucky enough to have very, very easy access to a whole bunch of teachers. I've got very, very good friends of mine that are teachers, and I've got access to just kind of like Representative Nyman, that you can pick up call the wrong phone number and talk to an educator in Cheyenne. And throughout the process, I've asked some very close friends of mine what they thought about this. And luckily, 3 of them were in this K-3 realm. And all 3 of them globally said the exact same thing. I was not prepared coming out of college to teach reading. I did not have a clue how to teach kids how to read. And they all said it emphatically. They all said, we need to be pouring money into this. We need to be fixing what's going on at the university. We need as much money and as much education as we can possibly get to this, because one of the other teachers, who's a 5th grade teacher, sees the outcomes of this 2 years later and is struggling beyond belief to try to keep these kids engaged in class, period. When they fall behind because they have one disability that could have been taken care of 2 years ago, they start falling behind, they start disengaging, they start becoming troublemakers in the classroom. It goes downhill. And so, I mean, these are conversations I had over dinner, multiple dinners, whatever you have, and very frank discussions. And I happen to think that we're attacking this right. And I appreciate the chairman's diligence to this and dedicating as much time to this topic as possible. And I also appreciate that we're going to look at taking this to the next meeting, because I truthfully think we've basically just picked up the rug, and we have found the amount of stuff underneath the rug that we have swept there for many years. So there's a lot of work still left to do, but I think we're on the right track. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
On that, and I hope I speak for both of us, that we think this business of getting kids learning how to read is the most important topic that we as legislators can focus on right now. And we know we're never going to be perfect. We know there are things that are beyond our control, but I think we owe it to our constituents to really focus on this, because this is going to determine the success of so many of their kids. So I think you can expect to see a continued focus on this topic.
Just a couple other things that haven't been covered that I did here. And that one of them is that using a computer with kindergartners to do an assessment may not be the best method of finding out what the kids, to measuring that. And I think that's a problem. And we may want to explore a different way of administering those tests, because I don't think it really gives us an accurate reflection of where the kids are. So that was one thing. The other one was that the kindergarten readiness thing is kind of all over the board. I know in our school district, the kindergarten teachers get together as a group and decide what they're going to use for an assessment. They make up their own assessment to determine if a kid is ready for kindergarten or not. And I think that has led to some real issues with I think there are some teachers that have the philosophy of wanting to keep their numbers up so that they let some of those kids in before they're really ready. And I'm not sure that they're really qualified to come up with an accurate science-based assessment that would give them a true reflection of that kid's readiness. And when that happens, what we have over 585 or something like that kids that were retained last year in kindergarten. That's one extra year that we're having to teach those kids. So we're going to make sure that they're ready, and think about the frustration of a kid who's not ready maturity wise to learn that, and the frustration of the parents that go through that, and the frustration that happens when you have to retain a kid. That's a pretty traumatic experience. Having been a principal in a K-12 school, I can tell you that when our kindergarten teachers made that recommendation, I had to sit down with the parents. It was not a pleasant experience. And so I'd like to see us think about coming up with at least a smorgasbord of assessments that the district could choose from, that would provide an accurate view of whether or not a child is ready for kindergarten. I think to prescribe one would be too prescriptive, but to give some ideas of what would work. And I think those are two of the items that I certainly see that we, in addition to some of the other things that have already been stated.
Yeah. I heard exactly the same thing about kindergartners and computers. I suspect that may be a universal, but I heard the same thing. And that I do think the question of readiness for kindergarten is one we're going to have to deal with. And because whereas most kids, I think, fit the age parameters we have, they're watching my late wife deal with some of these issues. There is a percentage who do not. And getting them an extra year to get more mature without causing any stigmas is a problem I think this committee needs to think about. How do we structure our system so the parents can make the appropriate judgment there, and the schools can guide them without putting any stigma on the kid, because the kids just plain don't mature at quite the same rate. So I think that's going to be an issue going forward. Senator Ellis, and then.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make sure are we going to do public comment?
Yes, we're going to do public comment. With that, we'll come back at 1:15 by that clock and resume, and public comment will be the first item and the bill will be the second.